Tonight, I'm going to explain every Greek god in the God of War trilogy, their secrets, how they rose to power, what they really wanted. If you enjoy this, please consider liking and subscribing. It tells me you'd like more deep dives like this. The world didn't begin with the marble halls of Olympus or the golden rule of the gods. Before the mountain was ever a seat of power, the universe belonged to the Titans. These were beings of raw strength and ancient scale, led by the Titan Cronos during what historical records call the Age of Creation. It wasn't a peaceful time, as their reign was defined by the Great Schism, a cosmic war that pitted the Titans against the primordials. The land was a shifting landscape of fire and stone, where the very foundations of reality were still being forged in the heat of battle. The Titans represented the forces of the earth itself, and they ruled with a heavy hand that brooked no challenge from the lesser beings that crawled beneath their feet. Cronos sat at the center of this world, a king who held the power of time and the weight of the mountains. He had seized the throne from his own father, and that act of violence left a stain on his spirit that he couldn't ever scrub away. He was a ruler who lived in the shadow of a prophecy, a warning that told him his own children would eventually rise up and overthrow him, just as he had overthrown the generation before. This fear wasn't a quiet concern, but a driving force that dictated every choice he made. He looked at his offspring not as a legacy, but as a threat to his absolute rule. He was a man who had reached the peak of existence and was terrified of the fall that he knew was coming. To preserve his power, Cronos committed an act of desperation that would haunt the memory of the world. As his children were born, he swallowed them whole, trapping them inside his own body to ensure they could never challenge his authority. Hades, Poseidon, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter were all consumed, their potential silenced by the paranoia of a father who valued his throne more than his blood. It's a dark image to consider, a king who had turned his own stomach into a prison for the future. He believed that by containing his children, he had outsmarted fate itself. He walked the earth with a false sense of security, unaware that the seeds of his destruction had already been planted. The lore suggests that the Titans viewed the world as a resource to be managed, rather than a garden to be tended. They were builders of monuments and shapers of continents, but they lacked the subtle touch that the gods would eventually bring to the realms. The Age of Creation was a time of massive projects and loud wars, where the individual soul had no value, and the only law was the law of the strong. Cronos presided over a hierarchy of giants who believed that their reign would last forever. They didn't see the world changing around them, and they didn't notice the growing resentment in the heart of Rhea, the mother of the swallowed children. Rhea couldn't stand the sight of her children being used as shields for her husband's ego. She watched as one after another was taken, her grief turning into a quiet, focused resolve. She knew that she couldn't defeat Cronos through force, so she turned to the only weapon that works against a tyrant: deception. She began to plan for the birth of her youngest son, a child who would be the one to finally break the cycle of the Titans. She was looking for a way to hide the light from the shadow, a way to ensure that the next generation would have a chance to breathe. The age of the Titans was reaching its peak, but the air was already starting to grow cold. This period of history established the pattern of violence and inheritance that would define the Greek era. The idea that power is something to be seized and then defended at any cost was a lesson that the gods learned from their predecessors. Cronos had set the stage for everything Zeus would eventually do, creating a blueprint for a rule built on fear and the suppression of the next generation. The world was waiting for a change, for a new kind of god who would bring order to the chaos of the Titans. But as the story of Olympus would eventually show, the new masters were often just as broken as the ones they replaced. The age before the gods was a time of giants, but the age of the gods would be a time of monsters. The transition from the rule of the Titans to the rule of the gods began with a hidden birth on the island of creation. Rhea, desperate to save her youngest son from the hunger of Cronos, replaced the infant Zeus with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. The king of the Titans, blinded by his own arrogance and haste, swallowed the rock without a second thought, believing he had finally secured his throne for eternity. Meanwhile, Zeus was spirited away to the hidden corners of the world, where he was raised in secret by the ancient Titan Gaia. Gaia wasn't just a protector, but a mentor who shaped the young god into a weapon designed to tear down the very establishment she had helped build. Zeus grew up with a heart full of stories about the brothers and sisters he had never met, trapped inside the dark of his father's belly. He wasn't just a god. He was a survivor who had been born into a war that hadn't started yet. When he reached maturity, he returned to the court of Cronos, posing as a servant to get close to the man who had tried to erase him. He fed his father an emetic, a powerful potion that forced Cronos to disgorge the siblings he had swallowed years before. Hades, Poseidon, and the others emerged from the dark, fully grown and ready for revenge. This was the moment the Great War, or the Titanomachy, truly began. A conflict that would last for 10 years and shake the foundations of the universe. The war between the Olympians and the Titans was a display of specific and total violence. It wasn't a series of skirmishes, but a global struggle that involved every force of nature and every power of the heavens. The Titans fought with the strength of the earth, throwing mountains and diverting oceans to crush the rising gods. The Olympians, however, brought a new kind of power to the battlefield. They were faster, smarter, and possessed a magic that was more focused than the raw energy of their parents. Zeus led his siblings with a strategic brilliance that the Titans couldn't match, turning the war into a test of will that slowly began to tip in favor of the younger generation. The decisive moment of the conflict came when Zeus forged the blade of Olympus, a weapon that was infused with the very power of the heavens. He didn't just want a sword, he wanted a tool that could end the war permanently. He used the blade to channel the strength of the gods into a single point of light, a force that was capable of breaking even the strongest Titan. In a final, cataclysmic battle, Zeus used the blade to banish his father and the rest of the Titans to the dark pits of Tartarus. He didn't just defeat them, he erased their presence from the world, locking them away in a prison that was designed to hold them forever. The age of the Titans was over, and the age of the gods had begun. The victory established a clear message about how the new gods intended to rule. They weren't interested in the chaotic freedom of the Titans. They wanted a world that followed a strict, hierarchical order. Zeus placed himself at the top of this new system, using the blade of Olympus as a symbol of his right to command. He had saved his siblings and won the world, and he expected the universe to acknowledge his brilliance. He saw himself as the bringer of light and the master of the storm, a king who had earned his throne through the blood of his family. He had broken the cycle of the father killing the son, or at least he believed he had. This war defined the identity of the Olympians as a group of warriors who had survived the impossible. They had seen the worst that their parents could do, and had come out the other side with a sense of entitlement that would eventually become their downfall. They built their palace on the highest peak of Greece, looking down on a world that they had claimed through violence. The Great War was the foundation of their power, but it was also the source of their deepest insecurities. They knew that a throne taken by force could be lost the same way, and that knowledge was a shadow that followed Zeus even into the brightest days of his reign. The Titans were gone, but the fear they had inspired remained in the heart of the new king. After the final echoes of the Titanomachy faded, the three brothers who had led the charge found themselves standing over a world that was suddenly quiet. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were the masters of all existence, and they had to find a way to share the spoils of their victory without starting another war. Historical records imply that they decided to draw lots to determine who would rule which part of the universe. This wasn't a process of merit or choice, but a gamble that would define the rest of their lives. Each brother took a breath and reached into the helmet of fate, unaware that the results would plant the seeds of a resentment that would eventually tear Olympus apart. Zeus drew the lot for the heavens, claiming the sky and the throne of Olympus for himself. He became the king of the gods, the master of the lightning, and the ultimate authority over both the divine and the mortal realms. He took the highest seat because he believed he was the one who had made the victory possible. He saw the sky as a reflection of his own elevated mind, a place of light and order that sat above the mess of the earth. He was the brother who had stayed in the sun, and he used his position to ensure that he remained the center of the world's attention. He was the architect of the new age, and he intended to be its only master. Poseidon took the oceans, becoming the ruler of the seas and everything that lived within the deep. He was the second most powerful Olympian, a god who commanded the tides and the storms with a restless energy. He saw the ocean as a kingdom that was just as vast as the sky, a place where he could build his own monuments and enforce his own laws. He was the brother who moved between the world of the gods and the world of the mortals. His power felt in every wave that hit the shore. He was satisfied with his lot, at least for a time, believing that his dominion over the water made him an indispensable part of the cosmic order. Hades, however, was relegated to the underworld, the dark realm of the dead that sat at the very bottom of the universe. He was the brother who was sent into the pit, tasked with managing the souls of those who had fallen and the secrets that the light couldn't touch. This division was seen as a profound unfairness by the ruler of the dead. He felt that he had been cheated by his younger brother into ruling a place of shadow and silence, while Zeus sat in a golden hall. He didn't want the underworld. He was forced into it by the luck of the draw. Just this sense of being an outcast stayed with him for centuries, a cold bitterness that colored every interaction he had with the gods above. The tensions present in this first arrangement were obvious to anyone who looked closely. Zeus and Poseidon lived in the light, surrounded by the beauty of the world, while Hades was trapped in a place of mourning and decay. The brothers were supposedly equals, but the hierarchy of their domains told a different story. Zeus was the king, and the other two were his subordinates, regardless of how much power they held in their own realms. This imbalance created a rift that never truly healed. Hades grew patient and cold, watching the light of Olympus from his throne of bone and waiting for the day the order would finally break. He was a god who had been given a cemetery instead of a kingdom, and he never forgot the debt. The division of the world was the first act of the Olympic era, and it set the tone for the divine politics that followed. It was a world built on a roll of the dice, a system where luck was just as important as strength. Zeus sat on his mountain and believed that the world was in balance, but he was ignoring the shadows that were gathering at his feet. He had divided the world to keep the peace, but he had actually created the conditions for a slow-burning disaster. The three brothers were the pillars of the universe, but they were built on a foundation of resentment and pride. The division was the beginning of the end, a long, quiet countdown to the moment the lots would finally be called back in. With the Titans locked away and the world divided, Zeus established what the lore calls the Olympic era. This was meant to be a golden age for both gods and men, a period of unprecedented stability and growth under the guidance of a strong, central authority. Zeus presented himself to the world as a just but firm ruler, a king who had brought light to a dark world and intended to keep it there. He built the marble city of Olympus to be a beacon of civilization, a place where the laws of the universe were written and enforced. In those early days, he was the version of himself that the world wanted to see, the hero who had ended the chaos and replaced it with a grand, divine order. He was originally a god who sought to protect his reign by keeping the dangers of the past under lock and key. He knew that the Great War had released powerful forces, evils like fear, greed, and hate, that could poison the minds of both mortals and gods if they were left to roam free. To prevent this, he commissioned the creation of Pandora's box, a vessel designed to contain these primal infections and keep them away from the light. He saw himself as the guardian of the world's spirit, a man who was willing to do the heavy lifting of governance so that everyone else could live in peace. He was a king who took his responsibilities seriously, even if those responsibilities were driven by a need to stay in power. The golden age of Zeus was a time of massive expansion for the human race. He encouraged the building of cities and the development of the arts, seeing the growth of mortals as a reflection of his own success. He was a god who walked among his people, sometimes in disguise and sometimes in his full glory, playing the part of the benevolent father. He wanted to be loved, but more than that, he wanted to be respected. He believed that his rule was the only thing standing between the world and a return to the brutality of the Titans. He was the master of the heavens, and he made sure that every storm and every sunrise was a reminder of his presence. But here's the problem. A rule built on the suppression of others is always a fragile thing. Even in the brightest days of the Olympic era, Zeus was looking over his shoulder. He hadn't forgotten the prophecy that had driven his father to madness, and he spent his days searching for any sign that the cycle was starting again. He wasn't just a king, he was a gatekeeper who was terrified of what was behind the door. He used his authority to manage the other gods, keeping them in a state of dependency and competition to ensure that no one could ever rise up against him. He was the center of a web of power that he had woven himself, and he was the only one who knew how many threads were starting to fray. The rise of Zeus was a transition from the raw power of the Titans to the sophisticated control of the Olympians. He traded the hammer for the lightning bolt, the blunt force for the calculated strike. He created a world that looked perfect from the outside, a city of gold and marble that sat above the clouds. But the foundations of that city were built on the blood of his father and the banishment of his kin. He was a god who had won everything, and now he had to spend every waking moment making sure he didn't lose it. He was a ruler who defined himself through his victory, unaware that a victory is just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. The Golden Age was a memory that the people of Greece would carry for centuries, a time when the gods were present and the world felt ordered. But for Zeus, it was a period of intense, quiet preparation. He was building the walls of his heart at the same time he was building the walls of his city. He was a king who had everything he ever wanted, and yet he couldn't find a moment of true peace. He sat on his throne and watched the world flourish, waiting for the first sign of the marked warrior or the first whisper of a rebellion. He was the all-father of a world that was holding its breath, and he was the one who was most afraid to let it out. The stability of the Olympic era was shattered when an oracle brought a new prophecy to the halls of the Great Lodge. The warning was clear and terrifying. A marked warrior would one day bring about the total destruction of Olympus and the end of the gods. For Zeus, this was the nightmare he had been waiting for, the return of the cycle that had claimed his father and his grandfather before him. He didn't see the prophecy as a possibility to be managed, but as a certainty to be destroyed. He became obsessed with finding the one who bore the mark, his mind already turning toward the violence he would need to commit to keep his throne secure. Zeus initially believed that the prophecy referred to Kratos' younger brother, Deimos, who had been born with strange red birthmarks across his body. To a king already poisoned by paranoia, these marks were a target. He couldn't handle the idea of a child growing into a threat, so he decided to act with a clinical, preemptive cruelty. He sent Ares and Athena down to the mortal realm with a simple order: abduct the marked child and bring him to the underworld. He wanted to remove the variable before it could ever become a problem. He was a father who was willing to destroy a family to save a kingdom, a choice that would eventually become the foundation for his own downfall. The abduction of Deimos was a moment of specific tragedy that set the entire story of the Greek era in motion. Kratos, still a young boy, tried to defend his brother, but he was easily brushed aside by the gods. He watched as his brother was carried away into the dark, a memory that would fester in his heart for the rest of his life. To honor the brother he had lost, Kratos tattooed his own body with a red mark that matched the birthmarks of Deimos. He didn't realize that by doing so, he was transforming himself into the very warrior that Zeus was most afraid of. He was creating the mark that the prophecy had warned about, a self-fulfilling cycle of fate and blood. Zeus believed that with Deimos in the pit, the threat to Olympus had been extinguished. He returned to his throne with a sense of relief, convinced that he had outmaneuvered the oracle. But the lore suggests that a prophecy isn't a map that you can fold up and throw away. By trying to prevent his destruction, Zeus had actually created the conditions for it. He had planted a seed of hatred in the heart of the one man who had the strength to finish the job. He had turned a loyal Spartan into a vengeful ghost, a transformation that was hidden from the eyes of the All-Father by his own arrogance. He was a king who had blinded himself with his own lightning. The fear of the marked warrior became a permanent part of Zeus's psychology. He stopped trusting his own judgment and started seeing threats in every shadow. He grew distant from his siblings and his children, always wondering if one of them was secretly working with the one who was destined to kill him. He turned Olympus into a fortress of suspicion, where every god was watching every other god for a sign of betrayal. He was a ruler who had become a prisoner of his own foresight, trapped by the very information he had sought out to keep himself safe. He had won a temporary peace at the cost of his own soul, and he was ready to pay even more to keep it. The prophecy was the mirror that showed Zeus the true nature of his rule. He saw a man who was more interested in his own survival than in the well-being of the world. He was a god who had forgotten the lessons of his own rise, becoming the same kind of tyrant that Cronos had been. He sat in his lodge and waited for the sound of a Spartan's footsteps, unaware that the mark he feared was already standing at his door. He had tried to kill a prophecy, but he had only managed to give it a name and a face. He was the master of a world that was already burning, and he was the one who had provided the spark. The relationship between Zeus and Kratos was a secret that sat at the heart of the Olympic rot for decades. It's revealed in God of War 2 that the king of the gods is the biological father of the ghost of Sparta, a connection that makes the violence between them even more tragic. Zeus had watched Kratos rise through the ranks of the mortal world, seeing the Spartan's strength and his rage as a reflection of his own nature. He saw Kratos as a useful tool for a time, a weapon he could point at Ares or the other threats to his order. But as Kratos grew in power and eventually took the throne of the god of war, Zeus's pride turned into a cold, directed terror. Zeus feared that Kratos was becoming too powerful to control, a god who didn't follow the rules of the mountain and didn't respect the authority of the Allfather. He saw the Spartans' popularity with the soldiers and his success on the battlefield as a direct challenge to his own dominance. To end the threat, Zeus decided to perform a grand act of betrayal. During the siege of Rhodes, he tricked Kratos into draining his godhood into the blade of Olympus, claiming it was the only way to defeat the Colossus. When Kratos was at his most vulnerable, Zeus descended from the clouds and murdered his own son on the road, believing that by killing the son, he could finally end the cycle of the father's death. The betrayal on the cliff was the moment the relationship between father and son was permanently shattered. Kratos, dying and humiliated, realized that the god he had served for a decade was nothing more than a paranoid murderer. Zeus, for his part, felt no remorse for the act. He saw it as a tactical necessity, a way to secure the future of Olympus by removing a dangerous variable. He was a king who had decided that blood wasn't as thick as power. He returned to his throne, convinced that the threat of the marked warrior had been buried with the Spartan, unaware that Kratos was already being pulled back from the brink of death by the Titans. Odin once spoke of the weight of a father's choices, and Zeus is the ultimate example of a father who chose wrong at every turn. By trying to kill Kratos, then he had created an enemy who was fueled by a rage that even the underworld couldn't contain. He had given Kratos a reason to live and a target to destroy. He had turned a god of war into a god killer, a transformation that was the direct result of Zeus's own fear. He had tried to break the cycle of the son killing the father by being the first to strike, but he had only ensured that the final blow would be even more devastating. He was an architect of a catastrophe that was now wearing his own face. The lore suggests that Zeus's actions in God of War 2 were the beginning of the end for the Olympic era. He had turned his most powerful asset into his most dangerous liability. He had shown the world that the king of the gods couldn't be trusted, a realization that began to erode the loyalty of the other Olympians. He was a ruler who was becoming increasingly isolated, his only companions the ravens of his mind and the memory of the son he had tried to kill. He sat in his lodge and watched the horizon, waiting for the return of the man he had left for dead. He was a god who had forgotten that a ghost can be just as dangerous as a man. The confrontation between Zeus and Kratos was a collision of two different ways of being a god. Zeus represented the old order, the structure and the hierarchy that had ruled for centuries. Kratos represented the new chaos, the raw, unbridled rage of a man who had nothing left to lose. When they finally met on the summit of Olympus, the world stopped to watch. Zeus saw the mark on his son's body and realized too late that he had been the one to put it there. He had spent his life trying to prevent a future that he had been building with his own hands. He was the father of a monster, and the monster was finally coming home to roost. The transformation of Zeus from a pragmatist into a paranoid tyrant wasn't just a result of his own choices, but a consequence of a cosmic infection. When Kratos first opened Pandora's box to find the power he needed to kill Ares, he didn't realize that the vessel contained more than just the strength of the gods. The box was also a prison for the primal evils that had been sealed away during the Great War. When the lid was lifted, these infections, fear, greed, and hate, were released into the world. The lore suggests that the evil of fear sought out the strongest mind it could find, which happened to be the king of Olympus himself. Zeus was infected by a literal, metaphysical terror that changed the way he saw the universe. The fear that took hold of Zeus wasn't a normal anxiety, but a deep, irrational paranoia that colored every thought and every action. He began to see his siblings as conspirators and his children as assassins. He looked at the world and saw only the potential for his own destruction. This infection is what drove him to betray Kratos and to turn Olympus into a fortress of suspicion. He wasn't a man acting out of logic anymore. He was a god acting out of a biological need to survive a threat that his own mind was creating. He was a king who had been hollowed out by a virus, leaving only the shell of the ruler he had once been. The corruption of Zeus was a slow rot that eventually consumed the entire mountain. The other gods, sensing the change in their king, began to adapt their own behavior to survive his shifting moods. They became more sycophantic, more secretive, and more willing to commit their own atrocities to stay in his favor. The golden age of Olympus was replaced by an age of shadow and fear, where the laws of the gods were used as weapons against the people they were supposed to protect. Zeus sat at the center of this decay, unaware that he was the source of the very chaos he was trying to prevent. He was a god who was trying to cure a plague by burning the world. Whether the man who died at Kratos' hands was the same god who had led the Olympians to victory is a question that the lore leaves open. Some believe that the original Zeus was buried under layers of infection and paranoia, a victim of the very system he had built to keep the world safe. Others believe that the fear simply revealed the true nature of the king, stripping away the mask of the benevolent father to show the hungry god beneath. Regardless of the interpretation, the result was the same: a ruler who was more dangerous to his people than the enemies he was fighting. He was a man who had traded his wisdom for a sense of security that was nothing but a delusion. The lore suggests that the infection of fear was the ultimate irony of Zeus's reign. He had commissioned the box to keep the world safe from the evils, and yet he was the one who was most thoroughly destroyed by them. He had spent his life trying to be the master of his own fate, and only to become a slave to a feeling he couldn't control. He was a king who had lost his connection to the truth, replaced by a version of reality that was written by his own nightmares. He sat in his lodge and listened to the whispers of the wind, hearing only the names of the people who wanted him dead. He was a god who had become a prisoner of his own mind, and the cage was getting smaller every day. The corruption of Zeus was the final act of the tragedy of Olympus. It was the moment the divine order became a divine disaster, a system that was no longer capable of sustaining itself. The Allfather had become a monster, and the only way to save the world was to remove him from the throne. Kratos wasn't just fighting a king. He was fighting a sickness that had taken the form of a god. When the final blow was struck, it wasn't just the end of a man, but the end of an era of fear. The world was left in darkness, but it was a darkness that was finally free of the shadow of the father of gods and men. Zeus was gone, and the infection went with him, leaving the world to find a new way to breathe. The final confrontation on the peak of Olympus wasn't just a battle between a father and a son, but the violent conclusion of an era built on blood. As Kratos reached the summit in God of War 3, the world was already falling apart around them. The floods had risen, the souls were wandering, and the sky was a bruised mess of storm and shadow. Zeus stood in the wreckage of his palace, no longer the calm king who had led the Olympians to victory, but a man completely consumed by the infection of fear. He fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, using the lightning and the strength of the mountain to try and stop the one man who had proven that the gods were mortal. He wasn't defending a kingdom anymore. He was fighting to keep his own heart beating in a world that didn't want him. The struggle moved from the balcony of the palace into the very heart of the mountain, a place where the physical and the metaphysical blurred into a single landscape of pain. Kratos pursued his father with a focus that was terrifying, ignoring the collapse of the world to ensure the cycle was finally finished. They fought inside the body of Gaia, the very titan who had raised Zeus, a poetic setting for the death of the king. Zeus used every trick he had learned in his long life, projecting his astral form and raining lightning down on the Spartan. But the lore tells us that Kratos was no longer just a warrior. He was a force of nature that had been forged by the crimes of Olympus. He was the consequence that Zeus had spent centuries trying to outrun. When the dust finally settled, Kratos found himself standing over the broken body of his father. He didn't use the blade of Olympus or the power of a titan to finish the job. He used his bare hands, strangling the life out of Zeus in a display of raw, intimate violence. He wanted his father to feel every bit of the rage and the betrayal that had defined the Spartan's life. As Zeus's eyes went dark, the astral manifestation of his fear rose from his body, a twisted form of the god that attempted to choke the soul out of Kratos. It was the final gasp of the infection, a last attempt to claim a victory through the very terror that had destroyed the king's mind. To defeat the fear, Kratos had to reach deep inside himself and find the one thing that the gods couldn't touch. Inside his own mind, he faced the ghosts of his past, his wife, his daughter, and the many victims of his rage. He realized that the power of hope, which he had absorbed from Pandora's box years before, was the only thing that could extinguish the shadow of Zeus. He used this light to banish the fear and return to the physical world to deliver the final blow. He beat the king of the gods until the mountain itself shook, ending the life of the man who had started the tragedy of the Greek world. Zeus died not as a hero or a ruler, but as a victim of his own paranoia. The death of Zeus caused a massive explosion that rippled across the entirety of Greece. It wasn't just the passing of a god, but the total collapse of the atmospheric order he had maintained for centuries. The sky vanished, replaced by a thick, storm-filled darkness that covered the ruins of the world. The lightning that had been his signature became a wild, undirected force that tore through the landscape. The people of Greece were left in a world without a sun, without a sea, and without a king. The fall of Zeus was the final act of a long disaster. a moment that proved that the power of the gods was a weight that the world could no longer carry. Some believed that the chaos released by his death was the only way the world could ever be truly free. As long as Zeus lived, the cycle of violence and inheritance would have continued until there was nothing left to break. His downfall was the end of a closed loop that had started with the murder of Uranus. Kratos stood on the cliff and looked out over the wreckage, a man who had finally killed his father and found that the victory didn't take away the pain. He had broken the throne of Olympus and extinguished the light of the gods, leaving the mortals to find a way to live in the dark. The king was dead, and the age of the individual had finally, violently begun. Ares was the black sheep of the Olympian family, a god who was defined by his mindless bloodlust and his refusal to follow the rules of the mountain. While Athena represented the strategic and noble aspects of conflict, Ares represented the raw, ugly reality of the battlefield. He was the son of Zeus and Hera, yet historical records imply that even his own parents loathed him for his violent nature. He didn't seek the glory of a just cause or the respect of his peers. He sought only the noise of the hammers and the smell of the blood, for he was a god of the pit, a being who thrived in the chaos of war and found beauty in the destruction of everything that others worked to build. His hunger for power set him apart from the other Olympians and made him a constant threat to the stability of Zeus's reign. Ares wasn't satisfied with his role as the god of war. He wanted the throne of Olympus for himself. He saw his father as a weak ruler who was too concerned with the balance of the world and not enough with the application of might. To achieve his goal, Ares began to reach beyond his station, looking for a way to create a perfect warrior who could help him overthrow the king of the gods. He wanted a soldier who was completely free of the limitations of morality and family, a weapon that could break the walls of the mountain and place the crown of lightning in his hands. The ambition of Ares was a specific and focused obsession. He didn't want to build a better world. He wanted to rule a world that was in a state of permanent war. He looked at the mortals of Greece and saw only a resource to be spent in his pursuit of the throne. He spent his days searching for the right candidate for his experiment, a man with the strength to lead and the rage to kill. He was a god who believed that a warrior's heart was a weakness that needed to be cut out, and he was prepared to do the surgery himself. He was a master of the battlefield, but he was a novice in the politics of the soul, a gap that would eventually become his undoing. Lore fragments tell us that Ares viewed the other gods with a mix of contempt and jealousy. He hated Athena for her wisdom and Zeus for his authority, she viewing their control over the realms as a personal insult to his own nature. He didn't understand why the world valued the peace he was so eager to destroy. This isolation made him dangerous, as he had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the collapse of the Olympic order. He was a predator in a house of scholars, a man who was waiting for the first sign of weakness to strike at the throat of his family. He was the god of war, and he intended to make sure that the entire world knew exactly what that meant. The search for the perfect warrior eventually led him to the city of Sparta and a young general named Kratos. Ares saw the Spartans' success on the battlefield and the depth of his ambition, recognizing a reflection of his own dark spirit. He decided that Kratos would be the one to help him seize the throne, provided the man could be properly forged in the fire of tragedy. He didn't want a partner or a son. He wanted a tool that would follow his orders without question. He began to intervene in Kratos' life, guiding the Spartan toward a path of violence that would eventually lead to a deal with the divine. Ares was a craftsman of misery, and Kratos was the stone he intended to shape. Ares believed that by creating a warrior who was a god in all but name, he could finally bypass the laws of fate and the defenses of Olympus. He didn't realize that by cutting out the heart of his soldier, he was creating the one thing that could actually kill him. He was so focused on his own rise that he ignored the warnings of the oracles and the concerns of his family. He was a god who thought he was the author of the story, and unaware that he was just another character in a tragedy that had already been written. He sat in his lodge and watched the Spartan grow in power, satisfied that his plan was reaching its conclusion. He was the original god of war, and he was about to meet the man who would take his place. Part 10. The Deal with Kratos and the Knight in the Village. The relationship between Ares and Kratos began with a moment of absolute desperation on a blood-soaked battlefield. When Kratos was about to be killed by the barbarian king, facing the total destruction of his army and his own death, he called out to the heavens for a savior. Ares, who had been watching the Spartan for years, saw his opportunity and descended from the clouds. He offered Kratos a deal, his life and victory over his enemies, in exchange for a lifetime of service to the god of war. Kratos, driven by his need to survive and lead, accepted the offer without hesitation. He didn't realize that he was trading his soul for a set of chains that would never truly be broken. To seal the pact, Ares bound the blades of chaos to Kratos' flesh, searing the metal into the Spartan's arms with the fire of the underworld. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of Kratos' status as the servant of Ares. They gave him a power that was beyond any mortal, but they also ensured that he could never walk away from the violence that the god demanded. Ares watched with a cold satisfaction as Kratos used the blades to slaughter the barbarian horde, the first of many lives that would be sacrificed to the ambition of the god of war. He had found his warrior, and now he began the process of turning the man into a monster. The final stage of Kratos' transformation was a cold calculation engineered by Ares in a small village dedicated to the worship of Athena. The god believed that Kratos' love for his wife and daughter was the only thing holding him back from becoming the heartless weapon he needed to seize the throne. To forge his warrior, Ares teleported Kratos' family into the temple that the Spartan was raiding, knowing that the smoke and the rage would blind Kratos to the identity of his victims. In a moment of mindless bloodlust, Kratos murdered his own wife and daughter with his own hands, completing the tragedy that would define the rest of his life. Ares stood in the ruins of the temple and watched as Kratos realized the depth of his crime. He didn't offer a word of comfort or an apology. He told the Spartan that this was a necessary step in his journey to greatness. He believed that by removing the family, he had removed the last of Kratos' humanity, leaving only the perfect killer behind. This was the night Kratos became the ghost of Sparta, his skin permanently turned white by the ashes of his family that were cursed to cling to his body forever. Ares had succeeded in creating his weapon, but he had also planted the seeds of a hatred that was deeper than any ocean and hotter than any flame. The lore suggests that Ares viewed the death of the family as a tactical success rather than a moral failure. He was a god who didn't understand the concept of love, or seeing it only as a variable that could be used for leverage. He expected Kratos to simply move on and continue his service, unaware that the Spartan's loyalty had died in that temple along with his wife. He had created a warrior who had nothing left to lose, a being who was now driven by a single, focused need for revenge. He had given Kratos the strength to kill a god, and then given him a reason to use it. Ares was a master of the battlefield, but he had made a fatal mistake in the mind of his soldier. For the next decade, Kratos served the other gods of Olympus, trying to find a way to erase the nightmares and the guilt that the night in the village had left behind. Ares watched from a distance, his own plans for the throne continuing to grow. He didn't fear the Spartan, believing that the chains of the blades were enough to keep Kratos in line. He began to lay siege to the city of Athens, a direct challenge to the authority of Athena and Zeus. He was ready for the final move in his game, unaware that his perfect warrior was already being recruited by his enemies to bring him down. The deal was coming to an end, and the price was going to be the life of the god of war. Part 11. The Fall of Ares. The end for Ares came in the streets of Athens, a city that he had turned into a slaughterhouse in his quest to spite his sister and his father. As the Spartan general Kratos arrived as the champion of the gods, the true scale of the god of war's arrogance was finally on display. Ares didn't believe that a mortal, even one empowered by Olympus, could ever pose a real threat to his divinity. He laughed as Kratos fought his way through the city, viewing the entire struggle as a game that he had already won. He was a god who had forgotten the taste of fear, a lapse in judgment that would allow Kratos to reach the one object that could tip the scales: Pandora's box. Kratos recovered the box from the Temple of Pandora and opened it, absorbing the power of the gods to grow to a size that matched the king of the battlefield. For the first time in the history of the world, a mortal was standing on equal footing with an Olympian. The fight between them was a display of raw, cosmic violence that tore through the ruins of Athens. Ares used the blades and the fire of his nature to try and break the Spartan, but he was facing a man who was fueled by a decade of rage and the memory of his murdered family. Kratos wasn't just fighting for the gods. He was fighting for a revenge that had been his only reason to live. The lore tells us that the death of Ares was a moment of profound revelation for the entire world. In the climax of the fight, Kratos used the blade of the gods, a weapon taken from a statue of Athens, to impale Ares through the chest. As the god of war fell, he pleaded for mercy, his arrogance finally replaced by a desperate need to survive. Kratos didn't hesitate, delivering a final strike that ended the life of the man who had sowed the seeds of his misery. The death of Ares marked the first time a mortal had ever slain an Olympian, a fact that sent a shockwave through the halls of the mountain. The foundation of Olympus was revealed to be brittle, and the gods were revealed to be mortal. When Ares died, his body exploded in a wave of energy that flattened the ruins of Athens. It wasn't a quiet passing, but a violent release of the bloodlust and the power that had defined his nature. The lore suggests that his death didn't just end a threat. It created a vacuum that the other gods were terrified to fill. They had used a monster to kill a monster, and now they were left with a Spartan who had the power of a god and the heart of a killer. Zeus and Athena watched from the mountain, realizing that by destroying Ares, they had empowered the very warrior that the prophecies had warned them about. The cycle was turning, and the god of war was no longer a son of Zeus. The fall of Ares was the beginning of the end for the old order of Olympus. It proved that the gods could be killed, and that the divine hierarchy wasn't as absolute as they wanted the world to believe. Kratos took the throne of the god of war, sitting in the seat that Ares had once occupied with pride. But the Spartan didn't find peace in the title. He found only the weight of the chains and the silence of the mountain. He had killed his master, but he was still a prisoner of the nightmares that Ares had created. He was a god of war who hated war, a paradox that would eventually lead to the destruction of every other god on the peak. Some believe that Ares was the only god who truly understood the nature of the world they lived in. He knew that it was a place of violence, and that the only way to survive was to be the strongest being in the room. He had tried to build a warrior who could prove that truth, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Kratos was the living proof that might makes right, a lesson that the Spartan would eventually use to tear down the entire world. Ares was gone, but the spirit of his reign remained in the heart of the new god of war. The original monster was dead, but the new one was just getting started. Section 4. Athena. Part 12. The Goddess of Wisdom and What She Actually Wanted. Athena was the primary handler for Kratos during his decade of service to the gods, a role that she played with a cold, strategic brilliance. While the other Olympians were content to use the Spartan as a blunt instrument, Athena saw him as a complex asset that needed to be managed with care. She was the one who promised him forgiveness for the murder of his family, holding out the hope of a peaceful mind to keep him loyal to the mountain. But historical fragments imply that she never truly intended to take away his nightmares. She moved the goalposts at every opportunity, giving him new tasks and new enemies to ensure he would never be free of his debt to the gods. She wasn't a mentor, she was a warden. Her role on Olympus was as the goddess of wisdom, but her wisdom was always slanted toward the preservation of the divine order. She saw Kratos as a useful tool to clean up the messes that the other gods created, a weapon of the gods who could be used and discarded as needed. She maintained a facade of compassion and concern for the Spartan, making him believe that she was the only one on the mountain who truly understood his suffering. But the lore suggests that her primary loyalty was always to her father, Zeus, and the stability of his reign. She was the architect of Kratos' service, weaving a net of obligations that kept him tied to a world he hated. The management of Kratos by Athena was a masterclass in manipulation. She knew exactly which buttons to push to make the Spartan follow her lead, using his guilt and his need for redemption as a leash. She spoke to him in soft tones, offering advice and support that always seemed to lead toward another war. She was the one who directed him to find Pandora's box and the one who guided him in the fight against Ares. She wanted the god of war gone because he was a threat to the family. She used Kratos as the hammer to break him. She was a god who valued the results of a strategy more than the humanity of the people carrying it out. Kratos viewed Athena as his only ally on Olympus, a belief that she encouraged to keep him from turning his rage toward the mountain. He trusted her because she was the only one who seemed to offer a path out of the dark. But the lore tells us that Athena's wisdom was actually a form of cold ambition. She wanted a world that was ordered and stable, and she was willing to use any amount of violence to achieve it. She didn't care about the nightmares of a Spartan general, only that the general was functional enough to kill her enemies. She was a god who looked at the world from a high peak and saw only the moves of a game she was determined to win. The relationship between them was built on a foundation of dishonesty that would eventually lead to a disaster. Athena was the one who placed Kratos on the throne of Ares, giving him the title but withholding the peace he had been promised. She knew that as long as Kratos was the god of war, he would be a prisoner of his own nature and the expectations of the mountain. She had traded his soul for a seat on the council, a transaction that she viewed as a tactical success. She sat in her lodge and watched the new god struggle with his past, satisfied that she had managed the situation with her usual brilliance. She was a god of wisdom, but she was also a god of control. Athena's interest in Kratos was never about the man, but about the variable he represented in the grand equation of Olympus. She wanted to use his strength to secure the future of the gods, unaware that by doing so she was ensuring their destruction. She had spent a decade refining the perfect weapon, and now she had to deal with the fact that the weapon had a mind of its own. She was a master of the long game, but she was starting to realize that Kratos was playing a different kind of game entirely. She was the goddess of wisdom, and she was about to find out that even the smartest mind can be broken by a heart full of rage. Part 13. Athena's death and what came after. The death of Athena was a moment of specific tragedy that changed the course of the war on Olympus. During the final confrontation between Zeus and Kratos in God of War 2, the Spartan was prepared to deliver a killing blow to the king of the gods. But in a sudden act of sacrifice, Athena stepped in front of the blade, taking the strike that was meant for her father. She died in Kratos' arms, her last words a defense of the man she had served for centuries. She claimed that Zeus was Olympus, and that his survival was the only thing that kept the world in balance. She chose the father over the brother, a final act of loyalty to a system that was already falling apart. Her death was a shock to Kratos, who had viewed her as the only god worth saving. He hadn't wanted to kill her, and her sacrifice only served to deepen his rage against the mountain. But the lore suggests that Athena's passing wasn't the end of her story, but a transition to a higher plane of existence. When she returned to Kratos in God of War 3, she was no longer the goddess of marble and order. She was a spectral form, a being of green light and cold ambition who claimed to have gained a new understanding of the universe. She was a god who had ascended to a place where the lives of mortals and the survival of the mountain were no longer her primary concern. In this new form, Athena became greedy for the power that sat at the heart of the Olympic conflict. She began to encourage Kratos to destroy the gods and the world, claiming that it was the only way to truly be free. She wasn't acting out of a sense of justice or a desire for healing. She was looking for a way to rule whatever was left after the dust settled. She saw the collapse of the gods as an opportunity to seize the throne of a new reality, a place where her wisdom would be the only law. She was a master of the pivot, turning a sacrifice into a strategy for a new kind of dominance. The lore tells us that the spectral Athena was a much darker being than the one who had handled Kratos for a decade. She was more blunt, more manipulative, and completely devoid of the facade of compassion she had once worn. She saw Kratos as a tool for the total erasure of the old world, a force of destruction that she could guide toward her own ends. She gave him the blades of exile and told him how to reach the flame of Olympus, providing the map for the catastrophe that was about to unfold. She was a god who had tasted the void and found that it suited her, a being who was ready to watch the world burn to see what would rise from the ashes. Kratos followed her guidance, believing that they were still allies in the fight against Zeus. He didn't realize that Athena's sacrifice was never purely selfless, but a move in a game that he didn't fully understand. She had stepped in front of the blade not to save her father, but to ensure that the war would continue until every other god was gone. She wanted to be the only one left standing, a goal that required the total annihilation of her family. She was a god who had used her own death to gain a leverage that life could never offer, a transformation that proved how deep the rot of Olympus truly went. The return of Athena as a spectral advisor was the final piece of the tragedy. She was the one who provided the intellectual justification for the slaughter, making Kratos believe that his rage was a form of liberation. She sat on his shoulder and whispered the names of the gods he needed to kill, her green light a constant reminder of the world he was destroying. She was the goddess of wisdom who had traded her heart for a vision of a higher power, a being who was now more dangerous than Zeus and Ares combined. She was waiting for the final act of the story, confident that she would be the one to write the ending. Part 14. Athena and Hope. The final act of the Greek era was a collision between the ambition of Athena and the humanity of Kratos. After Zeus was dead and the world was in ruins, Athena revealed the true reason for her guidance. She told Kratos that she had hidden the power of hope, the most powerful weapon in existence, at the bottom of Pandora's box years before. She had expected Kratos to absorb it when he opened the box to kill Ares, and now she demanded that he return the power to her so she could use it to rule the new world. And she saw herself as the rightful heir to the power of the gods, the only being with the wisdom to use it to rebuild a ordered reality. She wasn't looking to help the mortals of Greece or to heal the wounds of the world. She wanted to become the new All-Father, a being who would govern through the power of hope instead of the power of fear. She viewed the destruction Kratos had caused as a cleansing, a necessary step to remove the obstacles to her own reign. She was a god who had completely abandoned the idea of service, seeing herself as the center of the universe. When Kratos refused to give her the power, her wisdom was revealed as pure, cold ambition. She grew angry and impatient, showing the same hunger for control that had destroyed her father. Kratos, however, had learned the lessons of the gods too well. He looked at the ruins of Greece and the spectral form of his sister, and realized that as long as the gods held the power, the world would never be free. In an act of ultimate defiance, he impaled himself with the blade of Olympus, choosing to release the power of hope to the mortals of the world rather than hand it to Athena. He wasn't just killing himself, he was killing the idea of a divine master. He gave the people the strength to rebuild their own lives without the interference of the mountain, a choice that was the final rejection of everything Athena stood for. Athena watched the power leave Kratos' body and spread across the world, her face twisted in a mix of disgust and disbelief. She couldn't understand why a man would choose to empower the weak rather than serve a goddess. She realized that her strategy had failed, and that the perfect weapon she had handled for a decade had finally turned its edge toward her vision. She left the ruins of Olympus in a state of quiet rage, her spectral form flickering as the light of hope began to fill the dark sky. She was a god who had lost everything because she couldn't account for the strength of a human heart. The release of hope was the final legacy of the Spartan. It proved that the cycle of violence and inheritance could be broken, not by killing a father, but by empowering a world. Kratos had found a way to use the very weapon the gods had hidden to ensure the gods would never return. He lay on the stones of Olympus and watched as the light reached the farthest corners of Greece, a man who had finally found a version of peace in the destruction of his own story. He had denied Athena her throne and denied Zeus his legacy, leaving the world in a state of chaotic, beautiful freedom. The goddess of wisdom was gone, and the age of the mortals had finally begun. Some believe that Athena's final appearance in the story was the clearest sign of how far the Olympians had fallen. She had started as a guardian and ended as a parasite, a being who was willing to sacrifice a world to feed her own ego. Her failure was a victory for the human spirit, a moment that showed that even the most calculated strategy can be broken by a single act of selfless courage. Kratos had won the war not through might, but through the realization that the power of the gods belonged to the people. The world was cold and the ruins were deep, but for the first time in history, the people of Greece were the ones who held the light. Section 5. Poseidon, Part 15. The God of the Seas. Poseidon was the second most powerful Olympian, a god whose dominion over the vast blue oceans gave him a level of influence that nearly rivaled that of Zeus himself. He didn't just rule the water. He was the master of the tides, the earthquakes, and the hidden depths that mortals feared to explore. He viewed himself as the unbreakable wall of the world, the foundation upon which the continents rested, and the barrier that kept the chaos of the deep at bay. His relationship with Zeus was one of mutual respect, but also a quiet, simmering competition. Poseidon knew that while Zeus ruled the sky, it was the sea that covered the majority of the planet, and that fact gave him an arrogance that defined every choice he made. He was a god who believed that as long as the water remained, his power was absolute. The lore suggests that Poseidon's pride was tied to the scale of his kingdom. He looked at the mountain of Olympus and saw it as a small island in a world that belonged to him. He spent his days in his golden palace beneath the waves, surrounded by the wealth of the oceans and the loyalty of the sea creatures. He didn't seek the approval of the other gods because he didn't feel he needed it. He was a being of ancient, raw energy who could sink a fleet or swallow a city with a single gesture. This arrogance made him a formidable ally, but also a cold, distant brother. He saw the struggles of the mortals as the movements of ants on a beach, interesting only when they dared to sail too far into his territory. His connection to Zeus was built on the shared history of the Great War, where they had fought side by side to tear down the Titans. Poseidon respected the order that his brother had established, but he always felt that the oceans were a separate, more vital world. He harbored a deep grudge against Kratos, not just for the Spartans' defiance of the gods, but for the specific destruction of Atlantis. In the events of Ghost of Sparta, Kratos' actions led to the total collapse of the legendary city, a location that Poseidon viewed as his most beautiful creation. This loss wasn't just a political defeat. It was a personal insult to the god's artistic and divine pride. He saw Kratos as a parasite that was slowly eating away at the edges of his empire. Poseidon's arrogance was his primary shield against the growing darkness that followed the opening of Pandora's box. While the other gods began to succumb to their own fears and insecurities, Poseidon leaned into his identity as the master of the sea. He believed that no matter what happened on the mountain, the oceans would remain untamed and untouchable. He didn't see the Titan assault in God of War 3 as a threat to his existence, but as an opportunity to prove his superiority over his ancient enemies. He was a god who had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable, a lapse in judgment that would eventually lead to a disaster he couldn't survive. He stood on the edge of the world and dared the water to rise against him. The lore tells us that Poseidon's power was a reflection of the sea itself, calm and beautiful on the surface, but violent and crushing underneath. He didn't have the patience of Hades or the wisdom of Athena. He had the relentless, rhythmic energy of the tide. He believed that he was the only god who truly understood the weight of the world, as he was the one who had to hold the tectonic plates together. This sense of self-importance made him a rigid leader who refused to adapt to the changing reality of the Spartans' revenge. He saw Kratos as a storm that would eventually blow over, unaware that the Spartan was the tide that was coming to take his throne. He was a being who had lived for thousands of years without ever knowing the taste of defeat. He had seen the Titans fall and the mortals rise, and he had remained the constant master of the deep. He sat in his lodge and listened to the reports of the Spartans' progress, dismissive of the idea that a man could ever break a god of the ocean. He was ready for the final battle, confident that his massive constructs of water and crab-like legs would be enough to crush any rebellion. He was the god of the seas, and he believed that the world was his to drown if he so chose. He was a god of marble and salt, and he was about to find out that even the ocean can bleed. Part 16. The Fall of Poseidon. The defense of Olympus during the Titan assault was Poseidon's final act of divine arrogance. As Gaia and the other Titans began their climb up the mountain in God of War 3, Poseidon didn't wait for them to reach the summit. He dived from the peaks of Olympus like a spear of blue light, crashing into the ocean and emerging as a massive watery construct. He took the form of a giant made of the sea itself, supported by the legs of a hippocampal beast and armored in the energy of the tides. He was a display of pure oceanic might, a god who was determined to show the Titans and the Spartan that the water was still the master of the world. He fought with a ferocity that flattened the smaller Titans and sent a clear message to the invaders. Kratos, however, wasn't deterred by the scale of the god's power. Using the strength of Gaia's back as a platform, the Spartan engaged Poseidon in a battle that tore through the atmosphere of the mountain. It wasn't a fight of strategy, but a struggle of raw, focused hatred. Kratos used the blades of exile to tear at the watery armor of the god, searching for the physical heart of the storm. Poseidon rained down lightning and crushed the Titan's skin with his fists. But he couldn't stop the Spartans' relentless advance. The lore suggests that for the first time in his life, Poseidon felt the cold grip of a fear he couldn't drown. He realized that the Spartan wasn't a mortal to be managed, but a consequence to be endured. The climax of the fight came when Kratos tackled Poseidon out of his massive water construct, dragging the god's physical body onto a ledge on the cliffside. Stripped of his oceanic armor, Poseidon was revealed to be a man of flesh and bone, vulnerable to the same violence he had inflicted on others. Kratos didn't use a magical weapon or a divine relic to finish the job. He beat Poseidon with his bare hands, a display of intimate, primal rage that was designed to make the god feel every bit of the pain he had caused. He gouged out Poseidon's eyes with his thumbs, a specific and horrific act of mutilation that blinded the god of the sea before the final blow was struck. When Kratos snapped Poseidon's neck and threw his body into the ocean, the law consequence was immediate and global. The moment the god of the seas died, the ocean levels began to rise exponentially across the entire world. It wasn't a slow flood, but a sudden, violent surge that swallowed the coastal cities of Greece and drowned the mortals who had lived under Poseidon's rule. The sea had lost its master, and without his control, the water became a wild, undirected force that sought to reclaim the land. The floods reached the very base of Olympus, turning the world into a vast, salt-filled graveyard. The era of the sea was over, and the chaos of the water had begun. Poseidon's death was the first major pillar of Olympus to fall, and it sent a shockwave through the rest of the pantheon. The other gods watched as the world below them was swallowed by the waves, realizing that Kratos was actually going to kill them all. The arrogance of the mountain was replaced by a desperate, frantic need for survival. They saw that the world was tied so closely to their lives that their deaths would bring about the total destruction of everything they governed. Poseidon had believed he was the unbreakable wall, but he was really just the first domino in a sequence of disasters that would leave Greece in ruins. The fall of the god of the seas was a poetic conclusion to a life defined by the belief that he was untouchable. He had ruled the oceans since the end of the Great War, and he died in a pile of salt and blood on the side of a mountain he couldn't protect. He was a being who had traded his heart for the vastness of the water, and he found that the water didn't care about his passing. The floods he released were the only legacy he left behind, a final, mindless act of destruction from a god who had forgotten how to be anything other than a force of nature. Kratos stood on the cliff and watched the world disappear beneath the waves, a man who had finally started the end of the world. Section 6, Hades, Part 17, the ruler of the underworld. Hades was the most patient and perhaps the most somber of the Olympians, a god who ruled the realm of the dead with a cold, focused discipline. He was the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, but his dominion over the underworld set him apart from the vanity and the politics of the mountain above. While the other gods were obsessed with their statues and their mortal worshippers, Hades was content to manage the endless stream of souls that arrived at his shores. He was a god of the long view, a being who knew that eventually every living thing would belong to him. He didn't seek the light because he knew the darkness was the only thing that was permanent. He was the master of the shadow, a king who found his purpose in the silence of the grave. His relationship with the other gods was marked by a deep, lingering resentment. He never forgot that he had been relegated to the underworld by a roll of the dice, while his younger brother sat on a golden throne in the sun. He felt that he was the one who did the most vital work for the pantheon, yet he was the one who was most often excluded from the glory of Olympus. This isolation made him fundamentally different from Zeus or Poseidon. He didn't have their need for admiration. He had a need for order. He ran the underworld like a massive divine machine, ensuring that every soul found its place in the pits of Tartarus or the fields of Elysium. He was a god who saw the universe as a ledger that needed to be balanced, and he was the one who held the pen. The lore suggests that the only softness in Hades' heart was his love for his wife, Persephone. He had taken her from the world above and made her the queen of the underworld, a union that was the center of his existence. When Kratos killed Persephone in the events of Chains of Olympus, it was a wound that Hades would never forgive. He didn't just hate the Spartan for his defiance. He hated him for the specific, personal loss of the only person who made the underworld bearable. This grudge was a cold, a hard flame that burned in his heart for years, waiting for the day Kratos would return to his realm. Hades wasn't a god of quick temper. He was a god of the eternal grudge. Hades viewed Kratos as a personal insult to the rules of his kingdom. The Spartan had visited the underworld twice and escaped both times, a feat that no soul was supposed to be capable of. To Hades, this wasn't just a military failure, but a violation of the cosmic order he had spent an age maintaining. He saw Kratos as a thief who was stealing his own life back from the dead, and he was determined to ensure that the third time the Spartan arrived, he would stay forever. He was a god who valued the finality of death, and Kratos was the living proof that even death could be cheated if a man was angry enough. He waited in his palace of bone, sharpening his claws and watching the shadows for the return of the ghost of Sparta. The underworld was a reflection of Hades' own mind, vast, structured, and completely devoid of hope. He had built a world where the past was the only thing that mattered, a place where the memories of the living were processed and filed away. He didn't care about the future because he believed the future always ended at his door. This perspective gave him a level of stability that the other gods lacked, but it also made him blind to the possibility of change. He couldn't understand a man like Kratos, who was driven by a need to rewrite his own story. Hades was a god who believed that the story was already finished, and he was just there to read the final page. He was a being of immense dark power, with his soul bound to the very fabric of the realm of the dead. He fought with the claws of Hades, weapons that could rip the soul from a body and add it to his own strength. He didn't want to kill Kratos. He wanted to own him. He wanted the Spartan to become just another ghost in his collection, a trophy that would prove the All-Father of the underworld was still the master of the end. He was a god who had spent an eternity listening to the whispers of the fallen, and he was ready to add the Spartan's scream to the chorus. He was the ruler of the underworld, and he believed that the dead were the only ones who truly knew the truth. Part 18. Hades and Kratos. The personal history between Kratos and Hades was a series of violent encounters that spanned the entire Greek saga. Every time Kratos died, or sought a path through the realm of the dead, he had to face the architecture of the god's kingdom. Hades had watched the Spartans' progress with a growing, focused loathing, seeing the man as a stain on the purity of his order. In God of War 3, the confrontation between them moved from the abstract to the physical, as Kratos arrived in the underworld to claim the soul of the god himself. Hades fought with a ferocity that was fueled by centuries of resentment and the specific memory of his murdered wife. He wasn't just defending his realm, he was settling a debt that was written in blood. The battle took place in the dark heart of the underworld, a landscape of bone and shadow that responded to the god's every command. Hades used his claws to pull at Kratos' spirit, trying to tear the Spartan's life away before the blades could find their mark. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his massive frame armored in the skin of the dead and the energy of the pit. Kratos, however, was a man who had learned how to fight in the dark. He used the very environment of the underworld against its master, turning the chains and the shadows into weapons. It was a fight for the ultimate control of the soul, a struggle that would determine the fate of every person who had ever died. In the climax of the battle, Kratos managed to seize the claws of Hades and use them against the god. In a moment of poetic justice, the Spartan used the god's own weapons to rip Hades' soul from his body, consuming the essence of the ruler of the dead to empower himself. It was a horrific and total defeat for the Olympian. As Hades' soul was torn away, his physical form became a hollow shell, a mountain of meat that collapsed into the dark waters of the Styx. The master of the end had met his own end at the hands of the man he had tried to cage. Kratos stood in the silence of the underworld, the soul of a god pulsing in his veins. The law consequence of Hades' death was a catastrophe that broke the balance of the universe. With the ruler of the dead gone, the underworld lost its tether to the world of the living. The souls of the dead, no longer held in place by the god's will, were released in a chaotic, screaming swarm. They poured out of the pits and the fields, wandering the ruined landscape of Greece with no place to go and no one to judge them. The distinction between the living and the dead vanished, just as the ghosts of the past began to haunt the survivors of the present. It was a world of permanent mourning, a landscape where the memories of the fallen were the only thing left. Hades' death proved that the gods were the only things standing between the world and a state of total metaphysical chaos. Without him, the afterlife was no longer a structured journey, but a random collision of spirits. The other Olympians felt the release of the souls and knew that the foundation of their power was crumbling. They saw that Kratos wasn't just killing them. He was dismantling the very concepts that made the world function. The underworld was an empty house, and the master was a ghost in the Spartan's pocket. It was a victory for Kratos, but it was a disaster for the spirit of the world. A moment that proved that some secrets are better left in the dark. The fall of Hades was the end of the most patient god on the mountain, a being who had thought he had all the time in the world. He had waited an age for his revenge, and he had lost it in a matter of minutes to a man who didn't care about time. He died in the dark, his soul consumed by the very warrior he had viewed as a pest. The lore suggests that the souls of the dead didn't mourn their king. They simply fled the cage he had built for them. Kratos moved on from the underworld, leaving behind a realm of empty thrones and wandering ghosts. The dead were finally free to haunt the living, and the All-Father of the underworld was just another name in the Spartans' Book of the Dead. Section 7. Hephaestus, Part 19. The Smith God and His Fall from Olympus. Hephaestus was the tragic artisan of Olympus, a god whose life was defined by the transition from the golden halls of the mountain to the dark pits of the underworld. He was originally the son of Zeus and Hera, a brilliant smith who created the weapons and the palaces that made the Olympians look like masters of the world. But his life changed forever after the events of the first god of war. When Kratos opened Pandora's box to kill Ares, the infection of fear took hold of Zeus, turning the king's mind into a cage of paranoia. Zeus began to blame everyone for the loss of his security, and Hephaestus was the first to feel the weight of his father's redirected rage. The king of Olympus accused Hephaestus of failing to protect the box and the secrets of the forge. In a display of senseless domestic violence, Zeus beat Hephaestus until the smith god was a deformed, broken version of the being he had once been. He was cast out of Olympus and banished to the underworld, used by Zeus solely for his crafting skills. He was forced to work in a forge near the pits of Tartarus, surrounded by the noise of the dead and the heat of the primal fires. He was a god who had been stripped of his beauty and his dignity by his own father, a betrayal that left him with a heart full of bitterness and a body that was a constant reminder of his failure. The lore suggests that Hephaestus's fall was a specific warning to the other gods about the nature of the new Zeus. It proved that loyalty and service were no longer enough to stay in the All-Father's grace. Hephaestus became a prisoner of his own talent, required to build the very things that Zeus used to enforce his paranoid rule. He spent his days in the dark, shaping the iron and the gold, for a family that didn't want him. He was the master of the flame, but he was living in a world that was cold and grey. He didn't seek revenge against Zeus because he didn't believe he had the strength to take it. He was a man who had been broken by the world he had helped build. His relationship with the other gods was one of distant, professional interaction. They would visit his forge to order new weapons or to ask for repairs, treating him more like a servant than a brother or a son. Hephaestus accepted this role because he had nowhere else to go. He lived in the shadow of his own potential. A god who had once stood in the sun and now lived in the smoke. He was a master of the forge, but his greatest creation was a secret that he kept hidden from the eyes of the All-Father. He was a man who was waiting for a change, even if he was terrified of what that change would look like. The lore tells us that Hephaestus's deformation was a physical manifestation of the rot that was spreading through Olympus. He was a beautiful god who had been twisted by the fear and the greed of his family. He represented the loss of the artistic spirit in a world that was becoming increasingly focused on war and control. He sat in his lodge and watched the souls move toward the pit, wondering if his father would ever remember the son who had built his throne. He was a tragic figure, a god who was literally and figuratively in the dark. He was the smith god, and his hammer was the only thing that gave his life a sense of order. When Kratos eventually arrived at his forge in God of War 3, Hephaestus saw a chance to find a different path. He didn't trust the Spartan, but he recognized a shared history of betrayal by the king of Olympus. He began to talk to Kratos, offering him information and guidance in exchange for the safety of his own secrets. He was a man who was trying to navigate a world of monsters, a smith who was looking for a way to protect the one good thing he had left. He was a god who had fallen from the highest peak to the deepest pit, and he was ready to play a dangerous game to ensure that the light didn't go out forever. Part 20. Hephaestus and Pandora. The greatest creation of the smith god wasn't a sword or a palace, but a being named Pandora. He had crafted her from the fires of the forge as an artificial daughter, a child of gold and spirit who was the only thing Hephaestus truly loved. She wasn't just a tool or a key. She was a person in his eyes, a being with a soul and a curiosity that brought light to his dark world in the underworld. He had built her to be a companion, a way to fill the void that his banishment and his deformation had left behind. For Hephaestus, Pandora was the proof that even in the pits of Tartarus, a god could still create something beautiful. She was his heart, hidden in a body of divine engineering. Zeus, however, saw Pandora as nothing more than a tactical asset. He knew that she was the key to the flame of Olympus, the only force that could protect the box and the power it contained. When he realized that Kratos was coming for the flame, Zeus demanded that Hephaestus hand over his daughter so she could be used as a shield. The lore suggests that this was the final, unbearable position that Kratos and Zeus put the smith god in. Hephaestus had to choose between the safety of his daughter and the demands of the gods. He tried to hide her, to keep her away from the violence that was consuming the world. But he knew that the Spartan wouldn't stop until he had reached his goal. When Kratos arrived at the forge and demanded to use Pandora to reach the flame of Olympus, Hephaestus realized that his words wouldn't be enough to stop the Spartan. Driven by a father's desperation, the smith god tried to kill Kratos with his latest creation, the Nemesis whip. He wasn't acting out of loyalty to Zeus, but out of a pure, focused need to protect the child he had built. He fought with a strength that was born from centuries of isolation and a life of being pushed aside. But Kratos was a man who had already sacrificed his own family for power, and he didn't hesitate to do the same to someone else's. Kratos killed Hephaestus with the god's own anvil, a brutal and ironic death for the master of the forge. As the smith god lay dying, his final thoughts were of Pandora, his last words a plea for her safety. He died knowing that his creation was going to be used as a key and then discarded by the man who claimed to be a hero. It was a tragic end for a god who had only ever wanted to build things. Hephaestus was gone, and the forge went cold, leaving Pandora alone in a world that saw her only as a piece of technology. The smith god had fallen for the final time, and the light of his daughter was the only thing left of his legacy. The death of Hephaestus proved that in the war on Olympus, there was no room for love or for art. Everything was being consumed by the need for revenge and the fear of the end. Kratos took the girl and moved toward the flame, ignoring the body of the man who had tried to save her. The lore suggests that Pandora felt the loss of her father with a depth that her artificial nature wasn't supposed to be capable of. She was a being of hope in a world of despair, and she was being carried toward a sacrifice that would end the age of the gods. Hephaestus had built her to be a person, and the world was determined to make her a tool. Hephaestus's story is a reminder of the collateral damage of divine obsession. He was a god who didn't want the throne or the glory, only the chance to work at his forge and love his daughter. He was destroyed by a father who didn't value him and a son who didn't understand him. He sat in his lodge and dreamed of the sun, and he died in the dark under the weight of his own anvil. He was the master of the flame, and when he passed, the fire of the underworld grew a little bit colder. He died protecting the only thing he had ever truly loved, a choice that made him more of a hero than any of the gods who sat on the peak of Olympus. Section 8. Hercules, Part 21. The 12 Labors and the Sun. Zeus never valued Hercules, was the most famous demigod in Greece, a man of immense strength who had spent his life completing the 12 labors in a desperate attempt to earn the title of a god. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, a heritage that gave him the power of the heavens but the mortality of the earth. He believed that if he did everything right, if he killed the monsters, cleaned the stables, and captured the beasts, his father would finally acknowledge him and grant him a seat on Olympus. He was the son who followed the rules, the one who worked himself to the bone to be the perfect child. But historical fragments imply that Zeus never valued Hercules for anything more than his ability to handle the chores of the gods. The resentment that Hercules felt toward Kratos was built on a foundation of deep personal jealousy. Hercules saw the Spartan as a man who had been chosen for the role of the god of war, without having to complete the same kind of grueling labors. He didn't see Kratos' suffering or his loss. He only saw the title and the throne. He believed that he was the more deserving son, the one who had proven his worthiness through a lifetime of service. To Hercules, Kratos was a shortcut, a man who had been given what should have been Hercules' reward. This envy was a fire that burned in his heart, fueled by the silence of a father who refused to look him in the eye. Zeus treated Hercules like a useful servant rather than a son. He gave the demigod impossible tasks not to help him grow, but to keep him busy and out of the way. He didn't want Hercules on the mountain, because the boy was a reminder of his own infidelity and the messy reality of his mortal connections. He wanted a son who was a weapon, and Hercules was too desperate for approval to be truly effective. The lore suggests that Hercules was a tragic figure of performance, a man who was always trying to find a version of himself that his father would like. He didn't realize that Zeus was a man who didn't like anyone, especially his own children. The 12 labors were meant to be Hercules' path to redemption and divinity, but they became a series of hollow victories. Every time he returned from a mission with a trophy, Zeus simply gave him another one. There was no end to the list, and there was no seat on the council. Hercules grew increasingly bitter, his strength becoming a weight that he could no longer carry with pride. He began to look at Kratos as the focus of his frustration, convinced that if he could just kill his half-brother, he would finally earn the approval he craved. He was a man who was fighting a war for a father who had already forgotten his name. Kratos viewed Hercules with a mix of pity and annoyance. He saw in his brother the same desperation for divine validation that had once defined his own life. He knew that the gods didn't care about labors or loyalty, and he tried to tell Hercules that their father was a monster who would never give them what they wanted. But Hercules couldn't hear the truth. He was too deep in his own story, too focused on the 13th labor that he had created for himself. He saw Kratos as the final monster he had to slay to become a god. He was a son who had been discarded by the mountain, and he was ready to kill his own blood to get back in. The lore tells us that Hercules was the ultimate example of the favored son who was actually the most neglected. He had the muscles and the legends, but he didn't have the heart of a free man. He was a prisoner of his own need for a father's love, a condition that turned him into a pawn for the All-Father's defense. He sat in his lodge and polished his armor, waiting for the day he could prove he was the better son. He was a man of marble and sweat, a hero who had done everything right and still found himself standing in the sewers of Olympus. He was Hercules, and he was about to find out that a father's approval is a ghost that no labor can ever catch. Part 22. Hercules and the Jealousy of Pandora's Box. When Kratos first opened Pandora's box to slay Ares, he didn't just release the power to kill a god. He unleashed a cloud of primal infections that sought out the strongest minds on Olympus. And for Hercules, that infection took the form of absolute envy. Historical fragments imply that this wasn't a new feeling for the demigod, but a magnifying glass placed over a resentment he'd carried for centuries. Hercules had spent his entire existence doing the chores of the gods, killing monsters and cleaning stables just to catch a glimpse of his father's pride. When the envy from the box settled in his heart, it turned that hunger for approval into a bitter obsession with his half-brother, Kratos. He didn't see Kratos as a victim of the gods. He saw him as the thief who had stolen the only title that mattered. The demigod became convinced that he was the neglected son, and that Kratos was the favored one, despite the fact that Zeus had spent years trying to murder the Spartan. It's a twisted logic that only makes sense to a mind poisoned by the box. Hercules looked at the throne Kratos had once held as the god of war, and felt a sharp, physical pain in his chest. He believed that if he'd been given that seat, he would have been a better god, a more loyal son, and a true hero of the mountain. He spent his days in the shadowed corners of Olympus, stewing in the belief that the universe had conspired to keep him small, while a monster was allowed to rule. His envy made him blind to the reality of the Spartans' misery, seeing only the crown and the lightning. Hercules began to view his entire history through the lens of this perceived unfairness. He looked back at his 12 labors and saw them as a series of tests that he'd passed with flying colors. Yet he was still standing in the sewers while Kratos was burning the world down. He felt like a joke that the gods were telling at his expense, a performer who had given everything to an audience that was already looking at the exit. The lore suggests that the infection of envy didn't just make him angry, it made him desperate. He needed to prove, once and for all, that he was the superior warrior. He decided that the only way to claim his rightful place on Olympus was to step over the broken body of the brother who had taken everything from him. Zeus likely stoked this rivalry to keep both of his sons occupied. The king of the gods knew exactly how to use Hercules' need for validation as a tool for the defense of the mountain. He didn't offer his son a seat on the council. He offered him a mission. He told Hercules that if he could stop the Spartan, he would finally be the hero he always wanted to be. It was a lie that Hercules was all too happy to believe. He wanted to believe that his father was finally paying attention, even if that attention was only because Zeus was terrified of the ghost of Sparta. He was a man who had been starved of affection for so long that he was willing to eat the crumbs of a tyrant's panic. The mental state of Hercules in those final days was a storm of insecurity and rage. He walked through the halls of Olympus with a heavy, rhythmic stride, his massive hands constantly opening and closing, as if he were already strangling the life out of his brother. He didn't care about the floods or the souls or the collapse of the world. He only cared about the confrontation. He saw the approaching war as his 13th labor, the final task that would erase the shame of his mortal blood and make him a true god. He was a man of marble and muscle who had been hollowed out by a feeling of second place, a hero who had forgotten what he was fighting for. By the time Kratos reached the arena in the sewers of Olympus, Hercules was already waiting in the dark. He wasn't there as a brother or even as a soldier. He was there as a rival who had lost his mind to the box. He didn't want to talk about their father's crimes or the fate of the world. He wanted to compare their resumes. He wanted to scream about the Nemean lion and the Hydra while the mountain fell apart around them. He was the ultimate example of how the gods used their children as shields. A son who was ready to die for a father who didn't even value his life. He adjusted his heavy gauntlets and stepped into the light, ready to finish a labor that should have never started. Part 23. The 13th. Labor and the fall of Hercules. The battle between the two sons of Zeus took place in a massive arena, buried in the sewers of Olympus, a gritty setting that reflected the reality of their relationship. Hercules didn't arrive with the quiet menace of Hades or the oceanic scale of Poseidon. He arrived with a theatrical pride, addressing the crowd of undead soldiers as if he was still the hero of 1,000 legends. He spoke of his labors and his glory, trying to convince himself as much as the Spartan that he was the one who deserved the title of God of War. Kratos, conversely, stood in the center of the arena with a cold, focused silence. He didn't care about the history or the sibling rivalry. He only saw another obstacle between him and the king of the gods. Hercules fought with a raw, overwhelming strength that was focused through the Nemean cestus, a pair of massive lion-headed gauntlets that could shatter stone and bone with a single strike. He moved through the arena like a juggernaut, trying to crush Kratos under the weight of his own physical power. He saw every blow he landed as a statement of his superiority, a way to prove that he was the better son. But the lore suggests that Hercules was fighting a war of ego, while Kratos was fighting a war of survival. The Spartan didn't waste energy on speeches or grand gestures. He looked for the opening and the weakness. He saw the desperation in his brother's eyes and used it against him, a strategist facing a brawler. The contrast between the two brothers was a tragedy of divine inheritance. Hercules was the son who had tried to play by the rules, a man who believed that the gods would reward his service with love. Kratos was the son who had broken the rules, a man who knew that the gods only respected the power to destroy them. As the fight progressed, the theatrical confidence of Hercules began to crack. He saw that the Spartan wasn't being broken by his strength, and he realized that his 13th labor was turning into his final mistake. He grew frantic, throwing the weight of the entire arena at his brother in a last, desperate attempt to claim the victory he felt he was owed. In the climax of the struggle, Kratos managed to strip the Nemean cestus from Hercules' hands, turning the demigod's own weapons against him. The final moments were a display of intimate, crushing violence. Kratos beat Hercules with the lion-headed gauntlets, a rhythmic sound of iron on flesh that echoed through the sewers. He didn't stop until the floor was stained red, and the face of the legendary hero was a memory. He caved in his brother's skull with a focused rage, ending the life of the man who had spent his existence trying to be a god. Hercules died in the mud and the dark. A son who had finally found his father's silence was the only thing that was permanent. The death of Hercules represented the ultimate failure of the favored son against the vengeful one. It proved that the labors of the gods were nothing but distractions, designed to keep the world under the thumb of the Allfather. Hercules had done everything right, and had still ended up as a pile of broken bones in a sewer. His passing was a grim reminder that in the house of Zeus, there was no room for loyalty or for love. There was only the cycle of violence and the hunger for power. Kratos stood over his brother's body and took the gauntlets for himself, a new tool for a war that was rapidly reaching its conclusion. He didn't mourn the man he had killed. He only looked toward the next flight of stairs. Some believe that Hercules' tragedy was the most relatable of all the Olympians. He was a man who just wanted to be told he was enough, a son who had been discarded by a father who only saw him as a tool. He died still wanting the approval that was never going to come, a victim of a system that thrived on the desperation of its children. The lore tells us that his death didn't cause a global plague or a rising tide, but it left a hole in the story of the mountain. The hero was gone, and the only thing left was the ghost of a man who had fought for the wrong side. Kratos moved on, the weight of the Nemean cestus a constant reminder of the price of a father's pride. Section 9. Hermes, Helios, and Hera, Part 24. Hermes. Hermes was the messenger of Olympus, a god defined by his incredible speed and a taunting pride that made him one of the most annoying beings on the mountain. He didn't have the brute strength of his brothers, but he possessed a mobility that made him almost impossible to catch. He saw himself as the fly on the wall of the universe, the one who saw everything and heard everything, but was never held accountable for any of it. He took a sadistic pleasure in mocking the clumsy Spartan, using his speed to dance around Kratos, while delivering sharp, biting insults. He was a god who believed that as long as he could run, he was untouchable. He represented the arrogant detachment of the gods, a being who thought the world's suffering was just a joke for his own amusement. His role on the mountain was as the bridge between the gods, the one who carried the orders of Zeus and the gossip of the court. He knew everyone's secrets and everyone's shames, a fact that gave him a sense of superiority over even the most powerful Olympians. He wasn't interested in the war or the fate of the mortals. He was interested in the spectacle. He watched the collapse of Greece from the rooftops of the city, laughing as the people struggled against the floods and the ghosts. The lore suggests that Hermes was a being of pure, unadulterated vanity. He loved his own speed more than he loved his family, and he loved his own voice more than he loved the truth. He was a god of the surface, a man who never stayed in one place long enough to feel the weight of his own heart. The chase through the city of Olympus was a display of Hermes' desperation and Kratos' relentless focus. Hermes used the verticality of the marble halls and the complexity of the architecture to lead Kratos on a frantic hunt, convinced that the Spartan would eventually tire or give up. He didn't realize that Kratos was a man who had climbed out of the underworld 3 times. The Spartan didn't care about the insults or the speed. He only cared about the objective. He pursued the messenger god with a patient, predatory energy, waiting for the one moment when the god's own pride would cause him to trip. He was a hunter who was willing to run across the world to catch a single bird. When Kratos finally caught Hermes, the confrontation was short and horrific. The Spartan didn't just kill the god. He severed his legs with the blades to take the boots of Hermes for himself. It was a clinical act of mutilation that stripped the messenger of the only thing he valued. Hermes died in a pile of his own blood, his taunts finally replaced by a scream that no one on the mountain was bothered to hear. He was a god who had spent his life running away from the consequences of his nature, and they had finally caught up to him on a marble ledge. Kratos put on the boots and moved on, his speed now a weapon that belonged to the man who had ended the messenger. The lore tells us that the death of Hermes released a specific and devastating plague across the remaining mortals of Greece. As the god's spirit left his body, A swarm of spectral insects poured out of the wound, a black cloud of hunger that consumed everything in its path. It wasn't a natural disease, but a divine rot that ate the flesh and the spirits of the survivors. The messenger of the gods had delivered his final message, and it was a message of total extinction. The people who had survived the floods and the ghosts were now being eaten by the very air they breathed. The world was becoming a graveyard, and the gods were the ones who were providing the dirt. Hermes' fall proved that even the fastest god couldn't outrun the rage of the ghost of Sparta. He had lived his life as a joke, and he died as a punchline. Some believe that his death was the moment the other gods realized that Kratos was coming for their very identities, not just their lives. He had taken Poseidon's eyes and Hermes' legs, a systematic dismantling of the Olympic body. The mountain was growing quiet, the laughter of the messenger replaced by the buzzing of the plague. Kratos stood in the wind and watched the cloud of insects spread. A man who had taken the speed of the gods and was already moving toward the next target. The messenger was gone, and the end was arriving ahead of schedule. Part 25. Helios was the god of the sun, the being who drove the golden chariot across the sky to bring light to the world. He was a god of immense radiant power, a pillar of the Olympic order who ensured that the cycle of day and night remained in balance. But his history was one of repeated capture and humiliation, a god who was often used as a tool by more powerful beings. In the events of Chains of Olympus, he was kidnapped by the Titan Atlas as part of Persephone's plan to destroy the world. He had to be rescued by Kratos, a debt that the sun god never truly acknowledged with any warmth. He saw himself as the center of the universe, a being whose light was the only thing that kept the darkness of the pit at bay. Just during the defense of Olympus in God of War 3, Helios fought from his chariot, raining fire down on the Titans as they attempted to scale the mountain. He was a display of divine, aerial might, a god who believed that the sky was his personal fortress. But the lore suggests that his arrogance was his undoing. While he was focused on the smaller threats, he was swatted out of the sky by the Titan Perses, his chariot crashing into the ruins of the city below. He was left on the ground, broken and vulnerable, the light of the sun flickering as his own life began to fade. He was no longer the master of the heavens. He was a god who was waiting for a mercy he didn't deserve. Kratos found Helios among the rubble, the sun god still trying to use his radiant light to blind the Spartan and escape his fate. It was a desperate and empathetic display from a being who had once looked down on the world with a golden gaze. Helios tried to bargain with Kratos, offering him the protection of the sun or a place in his court. He even tried to lie to the Spartan, claiming that he would help him find the entrance to the labyrinth. But Kratos was a man who had heard every lie the gods could tell. He didn't want a deal. He wanted the head of the man who had tried to blind him. He ignored the pleas and the promises, moving toward the sun god with a cold, focused intent. The death of Helios was one of the most brutal acts in the entire Greek era. Kratos didn't use a blade or a spell. He tore Helios's head off with his bare hands, the golden blood of the sun god staining the stones of the city. He didn't do this out of spite, but for a practical purpose. He needed a lantern that could pierce the darkness of the mountain, and the head of the sun god was the most efficient tool for the job. He turned a god into a flashlight, a final, horrific humiliation for a being who had once been the master of the light. He carried the head through the halls of Olympus, its dying glow the only thing that allowed him to see the path ahead. The law consequence of Helios's death was the total extinguishing of the sun. The moment his head was severed, the sky over Greece turned a permanent, storm-filled black. The world was plunged into a state of eternal darkness, the cycle of day and night broken forever. Without the sun, the temperature dropped, and the remaining mortals were left to huddle in the ruins, unable to see the monsters that were hunting them. It was a world without hope, a landscape where the only light came from the fires of the war. The sun god was gone, and the world was left to rot in a shadow that would never lift. Helios's fall was a symbol of the end of the Enlightenment that Olympus had claimed to represent. He was the god who brought the light, and when he died, the light went with him. Some believe that his death was the most devastating for the people of Greece, as it took away the one thing that made life bearable. Kratos didn't care about the darkness. He had lived in it for most of his life. He used the head to find his way through the shadows of the labyrinth. A man who was literally walking through the dark with the face of a god. The sun was a memory, and the All-Father of the sky was the only one left to watch the world go cold. Part 26. Hera was the queen of Olympus and the wife of Zeus, a goddess who had spent centuries watching her husband's infidelities destroy her dignity and her heart. By the time of God of War 3, she had become a drunken shell of the regal being she had once been. She spent her days in the gardens of Olympus, clutching a chalice of wine and hurling bitter insults at anyone who crossed her path. She was a woman who had seen the worst of the gods and had decided that the only way to endure it was to drown her own spirit in a bottle. She didn't seek to stop the war or to save the city. She only wanted to be left alone with her resentment. She represented the total moral collapse of the divine family, a queen of a palace that was already on fire. Her relationship with the other gods was one of cold, mutual loathing. She hated Zeus for his betrayals, and she hated his children for being the living proof of those betrayals. She saw the war on Olympus as a final, pathetic act in a long play of divine failure. When she encountered Kratos and the girl Pandora in the garden, she didn't see a hero or a key. She saw more of her husband's mess. She insulted Pandora, calling the girl a brat and a worthless creation. Her words fueled by a jealousy that had nowhere else to go. She didn't care about the child's purpose or her soul. She only saw another thing that was more important to the men of the mountain than she was. Kratos, who had a surprising amount of protective focus for the girl, didn't tolerate Hera's insults. He saw in the Queen of Olympus a reflection of the same arrogance and cruelty that had defined his own suffering. He didn't want to fight her, but he wouldn't allow her to stand in the way of his progress. When Hera continued to taunt him, mocking his past and his failure as a father, Kratos' patience finally snapped. He didn't use his blades or his magic. He simply grabbed the queen by the throat and snapped her neck with a single sharp movement. It was a quick, almost dismissive death for the most powerful woman in Greece. She died in the dirt of her own garden, her chalice falling from her hand and her wine staining the flowers. The lore tells us that the death of Hera caused the immediate withering of all plant life in the world. As the queen of the gods and the symbol of the natural order, her passing ended the cycle of nature itself. The flowers in the garden turned to ash, the trees across Greece lost their leaves, and the crops in the fields died in the ground. It wasn't a slow rot, but a total, metaphysical shutdown of the life force of the earth. The world was already drowning and dark, and now it was becoming sterile. Without plants, there was no food and no growth. A final, bitter curse from a goddess who had spent her life feeling like she was being ignored. Hera's fall was the end of the last shred of domestic order on the mountain. She was the one who was supposed to represent the family and the home. and her death proved that neither of those things existed anymore. Some believe that her death was the kindest mercy she had ever received, a release from a life that had become a permanent humiliation. Kratos didn't mourn her. He simply moved over her body to reach the next part of his journey. He had killed the queen, and the world was responding with a silence that was more terrifying than any storm. The gardens were dead, and the mountain was a place of cold stone and empty halls. The lore suggests that Hera's tragedy was a result of staying in a marriage that had already killed her spirit. She had been the All-Father's wife, and that title had cost her everything she ever was. She died as a drunk in a dying world, a figure of pity and disgust who had forgotten how to lead. Her death was the final act in the destruction of the Olympic household, a moment that proved that the gods were no longer capable of even the simplest forms of connection. The plants were gone, the sky was dark, and the water was rising. Kratos stood in the center of the dead garden and looked toward the palace of Zeus, the man who had broken every heart on the mountain. Section 10. Aphrodite, Part 27. The goddess of love and the decadence of Olympus. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty, a being who represented the decadence and the excess that had defined the Olympic era at its peak. While her brothers and sisters were fighting for their lives on the slopes of the mountain, Aphrodite remained in her private chambers, surrounded by her servants and her own physical pleasure. She didn't care about the war, the floods, or the plague, viewing the collapse of the world as a distant, messy inconvenience that didn't need to touch her. She was a goddess of the senses, a being who believed that as long as there was beauty and desire, the world was still worth living in. She was the final, hollow reflection of the corruption of the gods, a person who had traded her soul for a life of permanent indulgence. Her role on Olympus was to provide the aesthetic and emotional distraction that allowed the gods to ignore the rot in their own rule. She presided over a court of permanent celebration, where the only law was the pursuit of pleasure. Historical records imply that she was the most disconnected of all the Olympians, her mind entirely focused on her own physical state and the adoration of those around her. She didn't seek power through might or wisdom. She sought it through the control of the hearts of others. She was a master of the mask, a woman whose beauty was a shield that kept the reality of the world at a distance. She was the master of the surface, a god who had forgotten that love is more than just a feeling of the flesh. The interaction between Kratos and Aphrodite in God of War 3 was a moment of strange, quiet contrast in the middle of a global catastrophe. Kratos arrived in her chambers not to kill her, but to find a way to reach the forge of Hephaestus. Aphrodite didn't fear the Spartan. She saw him as a new and interesting variable in her world of boredom. She tried to seduce him, using her power over desire to try and distract him from his mission. She didn't care that he was the man who was killing her family. She only cared that he was a powerful being who could provide her with a moment of excitement. She was a goddess who had lost her connection to the moral weight of the world, seeing everything as a game of sensation. Why Kratos chose not to kill Aphrodite is a question that the lore leaves open. Some believe that he didn't see her as a threat to his journey, a being so disconnected from the war that her death would have been a waste of energy. Others believe that she represented a part of the world that he didn't want to destroy yet, a flicker of beauty in a landscape that was already turning to ash. Regardless of the reason, Aphrodite survived the Spartans' purge, remaining in her chambers while the mountain fell apart around her. She was the one god who chose to stay in bed while the world died. a final, pathetic act of defiance against the reality of the end. The lore suggests that Aphrodite's presence on the mountain was the clearest sign of the rot that Pandora's box was only finishing. The gods had become so focused on their own desires and their own pleasure that they had forgotten their responsibilities to the world. They were like the residents of a burning house who were too busy arguing about the furniture to notice the smoke. Aphrodite was the center of this decadence, a goddess who had turned the sacred act of love into a commodity for the divine elite. She was a being who had everything and yet held onto nothing, a queen of a palace that was made of gold and lies. Aphrodite's story is a warning about the cost of total self-absorption. She was a god who had been given the gift of beauty and had used it only to hide from the truth. She lived in a world of silk and perfume, while the mortals of Greece were dying in the mud and the plague. Some believe that her survival was the greatest punishment she could have received, as she was left to rule an empty mountain in a world without light or life. She was the goddess of love, and she was the only one left to love herself in the dark. Kratos left her chambers and returned to the war, a man who had seen the final, hollow heart of the gods and found that it wasn't worth the effort to break. Section 11. Perseus and the Fallen Heroes, Part 28. Perseus was once one of Zeus's greatest mortal sons, a legendary hero who had completed his own epic journey and earned the respect of the gods. But by the time Kratos encountered him in God of War 2, Perseus had become a desperate, broken man trapped in the realm of the Fates. He was there for the same reason Kratos was. He wanted to change his destiny and reclaim a life that the gods had taken from him. He had lost his wife and his kingdom, and he believed that if he could just reach the Sisters of Fate, he could rewrite the story of his own failure. He was a hero who had found that service to the mountain only leads to a dead end, a realization that had driven him into a frantic, aggressive madness. The difference between Perseus and Kratos was a matter of belief. Perseus still thought that if he proved his worth to the gods, they would help him. He viewed Kratos as a rival who was cheating the system, a fallen hero who didn't deserve the attention of the Fates. He believed that killing Kratos would be his final test, the act that would prove he was still the favored son of the Allfather. He didn't understand that Kratos had stopped believing in the gods long ago. Perseus was fighting for a return to the old order, while Kratos was fighting to destroy it. They were two reflections of the same tragedy, but one was looking back and the other was looking forward. The fight between them was a display of Perseus's cleverness and Kratos's raw power. Perseus used a magical helmet of invisibility, a gift from the gods, to try and stay ahead of the Spartans' rage. He moved through the flooded chamber like a ghost, striking from the shadows and taunting Kratos with his past. He thought that his divine relics and his heroic reputation would be enough to win the day. But Kratos was a man who had learned how to fight what he couldn't see. He used the water and the environment to track the invisible hero, his focus never wavering despite the tricks and the insults. He was a man who was done with heroes and the gods who made them. Kratos killed Perseus with a brutal, clinical efficiency, drowning the hero in the very water that filled the chamber. He didn't use a grand spell or a legendary blade. He used the environment and his own hands to end the life of his half-brother. Perseus died in the dark, his invisibility helmet broken and his dreams of changing fate silenced forever. It was a tragic end for a man who had once been a symbol of hope for the mortals of Greece. He had spent his life serving the mountain, and he died in a forgotten room, because the gods were too busy with their own war to care about his struggle. He was just another victim of the All-Father's indifference. The lore suggests that the confrontation with Perseus was a mirror for Kratos. The Spartans saw in the fallen hero a version of his own past, a man who was desperate for a redemption that was never coming. He saw the way the gods used heroes like bait in a trap, offering them a chance at greatness, only to lead them into a slaughter. Killing Perseus was a way for Kratos to reject that part of himself, to prove that he was no longer a pawn in the games of the mountain. He didn't feel pride in the victory. He felt only the cold reality of the struggle. He was a man who had killed the hero to become the monster the world needed. What Perseus's death says about the heroes of Greece is that their era was over. The time for noble quests and divine favors had been replaced by the time of total destruction. The world didn't need a man with a magic helmet. It needed a man with a heart of fire. Perseus had tried to save himself, and he had died because he couldn't let go of the gods. Kratos moved on from the room, leaving the body of the hero to be swallowed by the rising tides of the mountain. He was one step closer to the Sisters of Fate, and he was the only hero left who had the courage to say no to the king of the gods. The old stories were finishing, and the new one was being written in blood. Section 12. Persephone, Part 29. The goddess of spring and what was done to her. Persephone wasn't born into the dark of the underworld, but she became its most bitter resident. She was the goddess of spring, a being of growth and light who was taken from the world above and forced into a loveless marriage with Hades. This wasn't a union of hearts, but a transaction of power that left her trapped in a realm of shadow and mourning for eternity. She hated the gods for what they'd allowed to happen to her, and she hated the dead for being the only company she was permitted to keep. She felt like a bird in a cage, her spirit withering in a place where nothing ever grew. Her history is a reminder that the Olympians were just as cruel to their own kin as they were to the mortals who served them. Her life in the underworld was a centuries-long exile from the sun and the life she had been made to represent. She had to sit on a throne of bone and watch as the souls of the fallen arrived at her door, their grief a constant reflection of her own misery. She didn't find comfort in the authority she held over the dead. She saw it as a mocking reminder of everything she had lost. She grew cold and distant, her mind always turning toward the world she could no longer touch. The lore suggests that Persephone was the first Olympian to realize that the Order of the Mountain was a lie. She saw that the gods cared more about their own comfort than the happiness of their family. The resentment she felt toward Hades was a slow, burning flame that colored every interaction they had. He was her husband and her captor, a man who claimed to love her but kept her in a pit. She saw him not as a partner, but as the physical manifestation of her imprisonment. This hatred extended to Zeus and the rest of the council, whom she viewed as accomplices in her kidnapping. She wasn't interested in the politics of Olympus or the wars of the mortals. She only wanted her freedom, and she was willing to destroy the entire world to get it. She was the goddess of spring, and she was ready to ensure that winter never ended for the people who had betrayed her. In the events of Chains of Olympus, Persephone was the first god that Kratos ever truly faced in a battle to the death. She saw in the Spartan a kindred spirit, a person who had been used and broken by the gods for their own ends. She tried to offer him a version of peace, reuniting him with his daughter, Calliope, in the fields of Elysium. But it was a trap designed to keep him from interfering with her plan to end all existence. She wanted Kratos to be happy in the dark, so she could be free in the void. She was a master of the emotional bribe, a woman who knew exactly how much a father was willing to sacrifice for a single moment of peace. Kratos eventually realized that Persephone's plan was a threat to everything, even the memory of his daughter. He had to make the impossible choice to leave Calliope behind and return to the war. A decision that broke his heart but saved the world. He faced Persephone in a fight that moved from the fields of the dead to the heights of the sky. She fought with a desperate, frantic energy, her wings a blur of black light and her magic a weapon of pure destruction. She wasn't fighting for a throne, and she was fighting for the end of her own story. She was a goddess who had decided that the only way to win was to ensure that everyone lost. The lore tells us that the death of Persephone was a moment of profound significance for the underworld and the mountain. Kratos killed her with the gauntlet of Zeus, a weapon that had been designed to crush the enemies of the gods. As she fell, her spirit didn't return to the light. It vanished into the dark she had tried to destroy. She was the first Olympian to fall to the Spartan, a fact that proved even the goddesses of the High Council could be erased. Her passing left Hades in a state of permanent mourning, and Kratos in a state of permanent guilt. She had tried to end the world to stop her own suffering, and her failure only added more weight to the tragedy of the Greek era. Part 30. Persephone's Plan. The plan Persephone conceived was the most ambitious and destructive plot ever hatched by a member of the Olympic family. She didn't want to rule the world or to change the laws of the gods. She wanted to destroy the pillar of the world and end all life across every realm. She understood that the universe was held together by a fragile balance, and that if she could break the foundation, everything else would come crashing down. She sought out the Titan Atlas, a being of immense strength who had been banished to the dark, and convinced him to assist her. She promised him a release from his eternal burden if he would help her tear the world apart. To power her plan, she orchestrated the kidnapping of Helios, the god of the sun. She knew that the power of the sun was the only force strong enough to disrupt the energy of the pillar. Without the sun in the sky, the world was plunged into a state of chaotic sleep, a fog that allowed Persephone to work in the shadows without interference from the gods above. She moved the sun god to the depths of the underworld, using his radiant energy to weaken the structures that held the realms in place. She was a strategist of the end, a goddess who had mapped the weaknesses of the universe and was ready to pull at the threads until the whole thing unraveled. The lore suggests that Persephone's desire for total annihilation was a direct result of the psychological toll of her marriage. She had reached a point where existence itself felt like a burden that she could no longer carry. She didn't believe in a better future or a path to redemption. She believed only in the silence of the void. She saw the gods and the mortals as characters in a play that had gone on for too long, and she was the one who was ready to pull the curtain down. She was a being of pure nihilism, a god who had decided that the only way to stop the pain was to ensure that no one was left to feel it. Kratos' intervention was the only thing that stood between Persephone and her goal. He had to fight through the fog of Morpheus and the traps of the underworld to reach the heart of her operation. When he finally confronted her, she was standing over the pillar, watching as Atlas began to pull at the stone. She didn't try to explain her actions or to ask for forgiveness. She told the Spartan that they were both victims of a world that didn't want them, and that the only mercy was the end. She was a woman who had lost her connection to the value of life, seeing the destruction of the universe as a gift to the people who were suffering within it. The battle for the pillar of the world was a struggle for the survival of the universe. Kratos had to defeat the goddess and then bind the Titan to the earth once again, a task that required every scrap of his strength and his will. He killed Persephone and left Atlas to carry the weight of the world for eternity. A double tragedy that ensured the realms would continue, but the suffering would never end. Persephone's plan had failed, but it had proven that the gods were their own worst enemies. They had created a goddess of spring who wanted to be a goddess of the end, a paradox that revealed the deep instability of the Olympic order. Looking back, the plot of Persephone was a warning that the gods were no longer capable of maintaining the world they had claimed. One of their own had tried to burn the house down because she couldn't stand the people inside. Kratos had saved the world, but he hadn't saved the spirit of the gods. He had won a victory for the mountain, but he had lost his daughter and his chance at peace. The pillar was still standing, but the cracks were already starting to show. Persephone was gone, but her desire for the end remained a shadow that would eventually grow until it consumed every other god on the mountain. Section 13. Morpheus and the Gods of the Underworld. Part 30. Morpheus. Morpheus was the god of dreams, a being of shadow and fog who resided in the deep corners of the underworld. He was never a central figure on the Olympic Council, but he held a power over the minds of both gods and mortals that was absolute. When Helios was kidnapped and the sun was extinguished, Morpheus saw his opportunity to expand his dominion. He used the cover of the darkness to plunge the world into a state of permanent, chaotic sleep, a thick fog that swallowed the cities and the halls of the gods alike. He didn't use a sword or a hammer to conquer. He used the vulnerability of the spirit, proving that the mind is often the easiest place to build a prison. His actions during the events of Chains of Olympus reveal how fragile the order of the mountain truly was. Without the light of the sun to keep the shadows at bay, the gods were revealed to be just as susceptible to the fog as the mortals they ruled. Even the high Olympians fell into a deep, dream-filled slumber, leaving the world without a master. Morpheus moved through the silence, his influence growing with every minute the sun stayed in the dark. He wasn't interested in the politics of the council. He was interested in a world of pure imagination and shadow. He wanted to turn the 9 realms into a landscape of his own design, a place where the rules of reality were replaced by the rules of the dream. The lore suggests that Morpheus was a god of the transition, a being who existed in the space between the waking world and the void. He didn't seek the glory of a war or the adoration of a temple. He wanted to be the one who controlled the thoughts of the universe. He used the fog to manifest the deepest fears and the darkest desires of those caught in his grip, turning the world into a mirror of its own subconscious. He was a master of the quiet takeover, a god who knew that a sleeping enemy is an enemy that can't fight back. He was the shadow that follows the light, and he was ready to become the master of the dark. Kratos was the only being who remained awake in the fog, his rage and his focus acting as a shield against the power of the dream god. He had to navigate a world where the streets were filled with sleeping people, and the air was thick with the energy of the underworld. He saw the way Morpheus was systematically dismantling the order of the world, Zeus, and he realized that the god of dreams was a threat that couldn't be ignored. Kratos didn't face Morpheus in a direct fight, but he fought against the effects of his power at every step of his journey. He was a man who was fighting to stay awake in a world that was trying to force him to close his eyes. The failure of the other gods to resist Morpheus proved that their authority was built on a very narrow set of conditions. They were powerful as long as the sun was in the sky and the rules were being followed, but they were helpless in the face of the unknown. Morpheus showed that there were forces in the universe that even Zeus couldn't fully control. When Helios was eventually returned to the sky and the fog was burned away, Morpheus retreated back into the shadows of the underworld. He hadn't been defeated in battle, but his window of opportunity had closed. He remained a lurking presence in the story, a reminder that the world of the gods was always just one shadow away from a total collapse. Morpheus represents the hidden dangers that sat at the edges of the Olympic era. He was a god of the mind, a being who knew that the true battle is always fought in the heart. His attempt to seize the world through sleep was a unique challenge to the Spartans' strength. Kratos had to find a way to pierce the fog and reach the light, a journey that required a level of mental fortitude that few other heroes possessed. The god of dreams was gone, but the memory of the fog stayed with the people of Greece for generations. They had seen the world disappear into a dream, and they knew that the darkness was always waiting for the sun to fail. Part 32. Thanatos. Thanatos was the god of death, a being of ancient and primal power, who resided in his own domain, deep beneath the underworld. He wasn't a son of Zeus or a member of the Olympic Council. He was a god who predated the rules of the mountain. He represented the final, inescapable end of all things, a force of nature that even the king of the gods couldn't command. He lived in the domain of death, a place where the concepts of time and fate were secondary to the reality of the grave. He was a god of the silence and the cold, a being who found no joy in the lives of the gods and no sorrow in the deaths of the mortals. He was the end of the road, and he was the one who waited for everyone. His connection to the story of Kratos was personal and tragic, as he was the one who held the Spartans' brother, Deimos, in a state of permanent torture. Thanatos saw the prophecy of the marked warrior as a trivial matter, but he enjoyed the role he played in the suffering of the Spartan family. He viewed Kratos and Deimos as small, noisy beings who were trying to fight against a fate that had already been written in the dark. He kept Deimos in his domain for decades, watching as the boy's mind was broken by the silence and the isolation. Thanatos wasn't a god of cruelty. He was a god of indifference. He didn't care about the pain he caused, only about the maintenance of his own cold order. The lore suggests that the existence of Thanatos was a reminder of the limits of Olympic power. Zeus had sent the marked child to the domain of death because he feared the prophecy, but in doing so, he had handed a member of his own family to a god who didn't follow his laws. Thanatos was a being who couldn't be bribed or reasoned with. He was the master of the finality, and he saw the gods of Olympus as temporary flashes of light in a universe that was destined to be dark. He didn't fear the lightning or the sea. He only waited for the moment they would finally go out. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, and he was the only one who truly knew the price of a soul. The confrontation between Kratos, Deimos, and Thanatos in Ghost of Sparta was a collision of three different versions of the end. Kratos fought for revenge, Deimos fought for his brother, and Thanatos fought for the integrity of death itself. The battle was a display of raw, primal violence that tore through the domain of death. Thanatos took the form of a massive, winged monster, his presence a weight that threatened to crush the spirits of the two brothers. He fought with a strength that was older than the mountains, trying to prove that death was the only truth in a world of lies. It was a fight for the legacy of a family and the future of a god. In the climax of the battle, Deimos was killed by the god, a moment of profound loss that fueled Kratos' final, devastating rage. The Spartan attacked Thanatos with a ferocity that even the god of death hadn't anticipated. Kratos didn't use a magical blade. He used the raw power of his own grief to tear into the god. He killed Thanatos in a display of intimate, crushing violence, proving that even the end of all things could be ended by a man with nothing left to lose. The god of death was gone, and his domain was left in ruins. Kratos stood over the body of his brother and his enemy, a man who had finally found the source of his misery and destroyed it. The fall of Thanatos was a moment that changed the nature of death in the Greek world. Without the primal god to manage the end, the transition from life to shadow became even more chaotic. It was a sign that the old forces of the universe were being dismantled by the Spartans' path. Some believed that Thanatos was the only god who truly respected the weight of the story he was in. He knew that everything finishes, and he was ready for his own finish when it arrived. Kratos moved on from the domain of death, carrying the body of his brother back to the world above. He had killed death itself, but he had found that even the death of a god doesn't bring back the people we love. Section 14. The Collapse of Olympus, Part 33. Pandora's Box and the Evils Inside It. Pandora's Box was the most dangerous artifact ever created by the gods, a vessel that was designed to be a prison but became a source of total corruption. Inside the box were the primal evils that had been sealed away during the Great War: fear, greed, hate, and others. Zeus believed that by locking these infections away, he could ensure a permanent golden age for his reign. But the lore suggests that the box was always a ticking bomb, a container that was under immense pressure from the very nature of what it held. When Kratos opened the box to gain the power to kill Ares, he didn't realize that he was releasing a plague that would eventually destroy every god on the mountain. The evils didn't just spread across the world. They sought out the high seats of Olympus, infecting the gods according to their own worst qualities. Fear took hold of Zeus, turning the king of the gods into a paranoid tyrant who saw enemies in every shadow. Greed found a home in the heart of Athena, transforming the goddess of wisdom into a being who craved a higher plane of dominance. Envy infected Hercules, and hate fueled the fires of Ares. The gods were already flawed, but the box took those flaws and turned them into pathological obsessions. The Olympians didn't just change. They were hollowed out and replaced by the very things they had tried to hide from the world. This infection was the true reason for the collapse of the divine order. It wasn't just the Spartans' blades that killed the gods, but it was the fact that they were no longer capable of ruling with any sense of justice or reason. They were acting out of a biological need to satisfy their own infected impulses. Zeus wasn't trying to protect the world. He was trying to quiet the fear in his own mind. Athena wasn't trying to help Kratos. She was trying to secure her own ascension. The gods had become prisoners of their own worst natures, a transition that was invisible to the mortals, but obvious to the man who was hunting them. The box had finished what the ego of the gods had started. But here's the thing about the box that the gods didn't realize. It also contained a single positive force. Athena had hidden the power of hope at the bottom of the vessel, a weapon designed to be used by a mortal should the evils ever be released. When Kratos opened the box, he absorbed this power along with the strength to kill a god. For years, hope sat in the dark of his own spirit, buried under layers of guilt and rage. He didn't know he had it, and the gods couldn't find it. It was the only thing that the infection couldn't touch. A flicker of light in a world that was rapidly going dark. It was the secret that would eventually end the era of the mountain. The lore suggests that the infection of the gods was an inevitable consequence of their own arrogance. They believed they could seal away the dark parts of existence and live only in the light. They didn't realize that you can't have one without the other. By trying to sanitize the world, they had only succeeded in creating a concentrated poison that was ready to consume them. The box was the mirror that showed the gods their own reflection, and they couldn't stand the sight. They died not as heroes, but as victims of their own refusal to accept the truth of the universe. The infection was the end of the gods, and the box was the final word. The collapse of Olympus was a slow, painful process of decay that was triggered by a single act of desperation. Kratos had opened the door, but the gods were the ones who had built the room. They had spent an age hiding their shames and their fears, and now they were being forced to face them in the most violent way possible. The world was in ruins, but the infection was finally reaching its peak. Some believed that the box was the only thing that could have ever ended the reign of the gods. It took the worst parts of their nature and turned them into the weapons of their own destruction. The box was empty, the gods were dead, and the world was waiting for the light of hope to finally be released. Part 34. The Cycle of Sons and Fathers. The Greek era of God of War is a story of a closed loop, a cycle of inherent violence that was passed from one generation of fathers to the next. It began with the primal god, Uranus, who was killed and castrated by his own son, Cronos. Cronos then seized the throne and became the king of the Titans, only to be consumed by the fear that his own children would do the same to him. This fear drove him to swallow his offspring, a desperate act of preservation that was ultimately undone by his youngest son, Zeus. Zeus then overthrew the Titans and established the Olympic order, believing that he had finally broken the cycle through the strength of his own will. But the lore tells us that the cycle wasn't broken. It was just changing its shape. Zeus was haunted by the same fear that had destroyed his father, a paranoia that turned him into a monster. He looked at his son, Kratos, and saw the same marked warrior that the prophecies had warned him about. He tried to kill the Spartan to secure his own future, a move that only ensured Kratos would return to finish the job. The history of the Greek gods is a record of men who were more afraid of their children than they were of their enemies. It is a story of power that is always seized through the blood of the father, and a legacy that is always written in the rage of the son. This cycle of violence was a fundamental part of the divine nature in Greece. The gods believed that power was a finite resource that had to be defended at any cost. They didn't see fatherhood as a responsibility to the future, but as a threat to the present. They raised their sons to be weapons, and then were shocked when those weapons were turned against them. Kratos was the final result of this long history of abuse and betrayal. He was the son who had been forged by the crimes of his father, a man who had no choice but to tear down the entire world to stop the cycle. He wasn't just killing a king, he was killing a heritage of misery. The lore suggests that the cycle was a trap that none of the gods could escape. Even the wisest and the strongest among them were eventually pulled into the same patterns of suspicion and murder. They were like characters in a play that had been repeated for an eternity, each one believing they were the hero while they were actually the villain. They couldn't imagine a world where the father stepped aside for the son, or where the son found a way to live without the shadow of the father. They were locked in a dance of death that could only end when there was no one left to dance. Kratos was the one who finally broke the board, a choice that was the final rejection of the Olympic way. Looking back at the entire Greek saga, the pattern is obvious and horrific. Uranus, Cronos, and Zeus were all architects of their own destruction, their hands already stained with the blood of their predecessors. They built their empires on a foundation of murder, and then wondered why the walls were starting to crack. They were the masters of the world, and they were the ones who ensured it would burn. Kratos was the consequence that they had spent an age trying to avoid. The son who was finally strong enough to say no to the cycle. He killed his father, and then he killed himself, an act of total erasure that was the only way to stop the wheel. The end of the cycle was a moment of profound, quiet freedom for the mortals of the world. They were no longer the fuel for a war between fathers and sons that had nothing to do with them. They were left in a world without gods, a world that was cold and dark, but finally theirs. Kratos had found a way to stop the violence by ensuring there was no one left to pass it to. He had killed the All-Father of Greece and broken the throne of Olympus, leaving behind a world that was free to find a new way to live. The cycle was over, the story was finished, and the Spartan was finally, violently, at peace with himself. Part 35. What Hope Actually Did. The final act of God of War 3 was the moment Kratos transformed from a man of revenge into a being of ultimate service. After the fall of Zeus and the total collapse of the Olympic order, Athena arrived to claim the power of hope that she had hidden in the box years before. She wanted to use that light to rule the world as a new spectral master, believing that the mortals still needed a god to guide them. But Kratos had seen the truth of the gods and their guidance. He looked at his sister and saw the same hunger for power that had defined his father. He realized that if he gave the power to her, the cycle of the gods would simply start over under a different name. In an act of supreme defiance, Kratos impaled himself with the blade of Olympus, choosing to release the power of hope to the mortals of Greece rather than hand it to Athena. This wasn't a suicide of despair, but an act of divine sacrifice that was the final blow to the Olympic era. As the light left his body and spread across the ruined landscape, it gave the people the strength to look at the dark and not be afraid. It gave them the power of hope, the ability to believe in a future that they would build with their own hands. He wasn't just giving them magic, he was giving them agency. He was telling them that the age of the gods was over and the age of the human heart had begun. The lore tells us that the release of hope was the only thing that could have ever saved the world from the destruction Kratos had caused. The floods were still high, the sky was still dark, and the plague was still spreading. But for the first time in history, the people had the inner strength to survive it. They didn't need to beg a god for a favor or offer a sacrifice for a harvest. They had the power within themselves to rebuild their lives and to find a new way to live. Kratos had given them the ultimate gift, a weapon that the gods had tried to hide for an age. He had denied Athena her throne and denied the world a new master. Athena left the mountain in a state of quiet, bitter rage, her spectral form flickering as the light of hope filled the horizon. She had lost her game, and she knew that her wisdom was no longer the only law in the universe. She was a goddess of a world that didn't exist anymore, a being who had traded her heart for a vision of a throne that was now a pile of rubble. Some believe that she eventually vanished into the void, just a ghost of a past that the world was already trying to forget. Kratos lay on the stones of Olympus and watched as the light reached the farthest corners of Greece. A man who had finally found the redemption he had been searching for since the night in the village. The gift of hope was the final legacy of the ghost of Sparta. It proved that a man could be more than just his rage, and more than just a tool for the gods. Kratos had found a way to use the very power that had been hidden by his enemies to ensure they would never return. He had broken the mountain, killed the gods, and given the world back to its people. It was a victory that was won through pain and blood, but it was the only victory that mattered. The world was cold, and the ruins were deep, but the people finally had the power to look at each other and see a future that belonged to them. The age of the Olympians was a memory, and the age of the mortals had finally begun. Looking back at the entire journey, the release of hope was the moment the tragedy of Kratos finally reached its conclusion. He had started as a soldier who made a deal with a god, and ended as a man who gave everything to a world that didn't even know his name. He had cleared the board so that a new story could be written. A story where the fathers didn't kill the sons, and the gods didn't rule through fear. He had found a version of peace in the destruction of his own story, a paradox that was the only way he could ever truly be free. The light was spreading, the water was receding, and the Spartan was finally, quietly, gone. The world was free, and the future was finally, beautifully unknown.